You awaken to the sound of a bell, not the sharp, ceremonial clang of a city tower, nor the pleasant toll of a church wedding, but a low, dragging, mournful ring. It echoes off the green hillsides, caught between stone cottages and lichen-covered graveyards. The year is 1666. The village is Ayham, nestled in Derbyshire, England, and the bell isn't calling anyone to prayer. It's warning them to stay away. This is not a story of mass death in one night. This is a story of slow dread, of a plague that crept between thatched walls and through cracks in limestone, taking one villager at a time over 14 months. A village that chose to trap itself with the disease, so the world outside could survive. The arrival, one parcel, many graves. It began, as horror often does, with something ordinary. A box of cloth arrived from London in August 1665, addressed to the local tailor. The city was already infected with plague, but this little village of Ayham had been untouched so far. The cloth had been damp. To freshen it, the tailor's assistant hung it near the hearth. By the following week, he was dead. Then the tailor. Then the tailor's neighbors. The village priest's record from that month reads, within the week, the boy coughed blood. There were boils, fever like burning oil. His skin turned the color of rotten milk. I buried him before his body cooled. They thought it might pass quickly, but it didn't. The death slowed, but never stopped. Instead, they hovered. 1 here, 2 next week, a lull. Then 3 in a single day. Panic simmered like a slow stew over the fire. And then, the decision was made. A village's impossible vow. The priest, Reverend William Mompesson, and his predecessor, Thomas Stanley, both convinced the villagers of Ayham to do something unthinkable. To quarantine themselves voluntarily. No one would leave, no one would enter. Not for food nor medicine, nor escape. They marked the village boundary with stones, some still visible today, and asked traders to leave food and supplies there. Payment was left in vinegar-filled holes in the rock, believed to disinfect the coins. People who heard the story laughed at first. A peasant's tale, they said. They'll flee soon enough. But the people of Ayham didn't flee, even when their children died, even when their homes stank of the dead, even when the hillside graves multiplied like flies. A horror measured in footsteps. Imagine this. You wake in the dark to the sound of someone digging. It's your neighbor burying his daughter. He will not ask for help. He dares not. By day, the fields lie silent. The sheep go untended. The bread oven in the village center remains cold. Some villagers try to pray. Others weep quietly. But some, and this is where the story shifts, hear the bell. The one not rung by priest or hand. Several villagers, according to oral accounts, claimed they began to hear a slow tolling bell at night, a sound no one else could hear. First 1 toll, then 2, then silence. Each time, the person who heard the bell would fall sick within days. They called it the death bell, the bell that called no one. No church in Ayham rang a bell during the plague months, not out of neglect, but out of fear. The tower rope could spread the disease. The congregation was gone, yet multiple letters and journal entries describe a sound like a bell underwater, or a faint tolling from beyond the edge of the woods. The priest's daughter, Catherine, is said to have heard it the night before she died. She had no fever, no signs. She went to sleep with a smile. By morning, her lips were blue and her pulse gone. The bell never appeared again until someone else heard it. Signs carved in wood. One cottage in Ayham, now called Plague Cottage, bore strange carvings discovered decades later when it was dismantled. FOR repairs. On one oak beam, beneath soot and layers of lath, was scratched, "Bell for 3, bell for me. Hear it once, you may be free. Hear it twice, it rings no more." Local historians dismissed it as a child's rhyme, likely added in the 1800s to embellish a folk story. But when carbon testing dated the wood panel to 1666, they reconsidered. Was it written by a survivor or a victim? No one knows. The grave behind the house, one of the most unsettling graves in Ayam, is not in the cemetery. It's behind a small cottage near the edge of the old village line. A single marker, a flat, rough stone, reads, "Here lies one who rang the bell." No name, no date, no cross, only that chilling phrase. Local legend says the man buried there was deaf, yet insisted he had heard the bell all the same. "It rang for me," he told his wife, days before vomiting blood and dying in the barn. Why would a deaf man claim to hear a bell? And why did the villagers bury him apart? You've stepped into a village frozen in dread, not a scream-filled panic, but a slow, grim silence, where children drew lines in the dirt to mark where the healthy could walk, where families buried their dead in their gardens, where a community stayed inside the gates of death, by choice. But still, one question haunts these mossy stone paths and sloping graveyards. Was the death bell just a sound of fear, or something far older, that chose Ayam to ring once more? Behind a small cottage near the edge of the old village line, a single marker, a flat, rough stone, reads, "Here lies one who rang the bell." No name, no date, no cross, only that chilling phrase. Local legend says the man buried there was deaf, yet insisted he had heard the bell all the same. "It rang for me," he told days before vomiting blood and dying in the barn. Why would a deaf man claim to hear a bell? And why did the villagers bury him apart? You've stepped into a village frozen in dread, not a scream-filled panic, but a slow, grim silence, where children drew lines in the dirt to mark where the healthy could walk, where families buried their dead in their gardens, where a community stayed inside the gates of death, by choice. But still, one question haunts these mossy stone paths and sloping graveyards. Was the death bell just a sound of fear, or something far older, that chose Ayam to ring once more? Behind a small cottage near the edge of the old village line, a single marker, a flat, rough stone, reads, "Here lies one who rang the bell." No name, no date, no cross, only that chilling phrase. Local legend says the man buried there was deaf, yet insisted he had heard the bell all the same. "It rang for me," he told days before vomiting blood and dying in the barn. Why would a deaf man claim to hear a bell? And why did the villagers bury him apart? You've stepped into the sickness spread like fog after rain. Within weeks of George Vickers' death, other homes in Ayam began falling silent. Entire cottages were shuttered, curtains drawn. No smoke from chimneys. The signs were always the same: a sudden fever, aching limbs, dark swellings along the neck and groin. Then silence. Ayam was still, but not peaceful. The kind of stillness that crept under doorways and settled behind your ribs. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but full of waiting. Reverend William Mompesson stood at the doorway of his parsonage, watching as a cart rattled down the lane, a single body wrapped in linen across its boards. He was a tall man with a stern face, yet his eyes bore the weariness of someone who had seen too much and feared what still lay ahead. A week earlier, he had buried his own maid. Now he prepared to dig deeper into both the earth and his conscience. The villagers turned to him for answers. But there were no sermons that could stop the plague. No psalms that could quiet the sobs behind closed doors. What Mompesson proposed instead, on a chilled morning as gray clouds pressed low, was not salvation, but sacrifice. He addressed the people of Ayam in the graveyard, near the lichen-covered yew tree that had stood for centuries, longer than the church, longer than memory. Men and women came in silence, faces hollow, scarves over their mouths. Children clutched at skirts. Crows perched in the branches above, unusually still. "We must think not only of ourselves," Mompesson began, voice low, steady. But of those beyond this valley, Bakewell, Sheffield, the Peak District, if we allow the sickness to leave, EYA may ... we carry death to hundreds more. A murmur passed through the gathered crowd. You ask us to stay? A blacksmith asked. His knuckles were white around the handle of his cap. Even as our families die? I ask you to be the wall, Mompesson said. We can choose fear, or we can choose purpose. Let our suffering be the end of it. It was madness, some thought. A death sentence painted with holy words. And yet no one left. The villagers agreed. Perhaps it was faith. Perhaps it was duty. Perhaps it was that strange resignation that comes when you realize you are already living beside death, and there is nowhere left to run. The isolation pact began quietly. Boundary stones were placed at the outer edges of the village, worn. Rocks from the hills, carved with small notches to mark the corners of Aeon's invisible cage. Coins were left in drilled holes in the stone, soaking in vinegar as crude payment for food or medicine dropped off by nearby villagers. No contact was allowed. No crossing permitted. At first, it worked. Provisions came. No one outside the village fell ill. The summer sun softened the fear, and hope crept in like a timid guest. But then the deaths accelerated. The village became a place of whispers. People spoke only through closed doors or from across gardens. Children no longer played. The market square emptied. The plague didn't just take bodies, it took voices, movement, color. Some villagers buried their own dead in gardens. Others left the bodies wrapped at the church gate, too weak or afraid to say goodbye properly. The ground grew heavy with sorrow. The air heavier still. And then the bell began to ring. It started one night, late in August. Mompesson was in the chapel, praying by candlelight, when he heard the toll. A single chime, slow, distant, full of weight. He froze. The bell rope hung beside him, still. He ran outside, heart pounding. The streets were empty. Only the sound of leaves stirring. The next morning, several others claimed to have heard it. But no one had touched the bell. No one admitted to it. The bell ringer had died 3 days prior. They began to call it the plague bell. Not the one in the church, but the other, the unseen one. The one that seemed to sound when no one was watching. It didn't ring every day. Only when someone died alone. Only when a child was taken in their sleep. Only when a whole household vanished behind their walls. Mompesson did not speak of it in sermons, but he began to mark the times it rang, and soon realized it always came before the death was known. As though it already knew. By autumn, the village had become unrecognizable. Grass grew between cobblestones. Doors were nailed shut with crude crosses carved into the wood. The apothecary's windows were broken, the forge cold, the school empty. People rarely left their homes unless absolutely necessary. They walked with scarves soaked in herbs, avoided eye contact, refused to touch anything they hadn't brought from home. Yet despite every precaution, death still found its way in, slipping under door cracks, hiding in apples, clinging to. Letters passed between family members. Some villagers blamed rats. Others blamed God. A few blamed each other. There were whispers about old Mr. Hadley, who continued to roam the village each morning with his cane, muttering to himself and knocking on doors with a strange tune. When someone asked what he was doing, he simply replied, "I'm checking who's next." He was always right. Others spoke of the well near the orchard that had gone bitter. The birds stopped drinking from it. A little girl named Anne told her mother she saw a woman floating just beneath the water, but when they checked, it was clear, except the water was warm and smelled faintly of lavender. The most feared place became the churchyard. At first, families gathered there together, keeping distance but still sharing hymns, prayer, even small nods of comfort. But by October, it was silent. Too many graves. Too many shallow mounds of earth. The bell tolled again on a frost-bitten morning. A child's voice, some claimed, crying out between the chimes. Mompesson stood alone beneath the yew tree, listening. Was this still the voice of plague? Or had something else taken root in Am? To roam the village each morning with his cane, muttering to himself and knocking on doors with a strange tune. When someone asked what he was doing, he simply replied, "I'm checking who's next." He was always right. Others spoke of the well near the orchard that had gone bitter. The birds stopped drinking from it. A little girl named Anne told her mother she saw a woman floating just beneath the water, but when they checked, it was clear, except the water was warm and smelled faintly of lavender. The most feared place became the churchyard. At first, families gathered there together, keeping distance but still sharing hymns, prayer, even small nods of comfort. But by October, it was silent. Too many graves. Too many shallow mounds of earth. Thought the bell tolled again on a frost-bitten morning. A child's voice, some claimed, crying out between the chimes. Mompesson stood alone beneath the yew tree, listening. Was this still the voice of plague? Or had something else taken root in Am? To roam the village each morning with his cane, muttering to himself and knocking on doors with a strange tune. When someone asked what he was doing, he simply replied, "I'm checking who's next." He was always right. Others spoke of the well near the orchard that had gone bitter. The birds stopped drinking from it. A little girl named Anne told her mother she saw a woman floating just beneath the water, but when they checked, autumn bled into winter. The leaves that had once blazed red and gold now lay brown and sodden on the ground, turning to sludge beneath the boots of the few villagers still strong enough to walk. Am had become a village of whispers and shallow breaths. The laughter of children had long vanished. Church hymns were replaced by the shuffling of footsteps and the soft thump of freshly dug graves. And still, the bell tolled, but it wasn't always rung by human hands. One night, under a sickle moon, young Alice Hadley, barely 13 and already orphaned, heard the bell toll at midnight, but no one had died that day. She had watched. Everyone left in the village was accounted for. Curious, she crept barefoot through the frost-touched grass toward the bell tower, her candle trembling in the wind. The church stood dark and locked, yet the bell above swayed gently, chiming low and clear in the silence. Alice wasn't the only one who had heard it. Widow Fletcher, whose 3 sons lay side by side in the churchyard, stepped out from her cottage, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Behind her, Thomas Rowe, the gravedigger, once silent and stoic, now hollow-eyed and pale, emerged too, blinking as if waking from a nightmare. No one spoke. They simply stood beneath the tower, listening. That was the first night they saw it. Figure, impossibly tall and thin, cloaked in darkness, stepped out from the church's side door, though no one had opened it. Its face was hidden beneath a veil of soot-colored mist. As it walked, the sound of dry leaves crumbling followed its steps. Alice would later describe its hands as too long, with fingers like burnt twigs. Others, those who dared to speak of it, said it smelled like old metal and rot. Some called it the Watcher. Others believed it was death itself only. It had lost its way in Am and now lingered, confused, drawn by the village's strange choice to embrace its own demise. From that night on, the bell tolled at random. Sometimes just before dawn, sometimes in the heart of the afternoon. Always when the fog was thickest. Always when the silence felt too heavy. And when it rang, another villager died, even if they had shown no signs of illness the day before. Soon, the villagers stopped responding to the bell. They stayed inside, shuttered their windows, blocked their chimneys, whispered prayers into their bedding. But it didn't matter. The bell had learned to find them. And the figure began to appear more often, not just by the church, but near. Homes, watching from behind hedges, peeking through broken window panes. Reverend Mompesson kept to his vow. He did not flee. He wrote letters to neighboring clergy, describing not just the symptoms of the plague, but the dreams of a tall figure, of laughter that sounded like sobbing, of graves that moved. He wrote, "There is a presence here. It does not touch, it does not speak, but it knows us, it counts us. It tolls the bell long after our lungs have stilled." One by one, the letters stopped, and still, the bell rang. Always when the silence felt too heavy, and when it rang, another villager died, even if they had shown no signs of illness the day before. Soon, the villagers stopped responding to the bell. They stayed inside, shuttered their windows, blocked their chimneys, whispered prayers into their bedding. But it didn't matter. The bell had learned to find them. And the figure began to appear more often, not just by the church, but near homes, watching from behind hedges, peeking through broken window panes. Reverend Mompesson kept to his vow. He did not flee. He wrote letters to neighboring clergy, describing not just the symptoms of the plague, but the dreams of a tall figure, of laughter that sounded like sobbing, of graves that moved. He wrote, "There is a presence here. It does not touch, it does not speak, but it knows us, it counts us. It tolls the bell long after our lungs have stilled." One by one, the letters stopped, and still, the bell rang. It felt too heavy, and when it rang, another villager died, even if they had shown no signs of illness the day before. Soon, the villagers stopped responding to the bell. They stayed inside, shuttered their windows, blocked their chimneys, whispered prayers into their bedding. But it didn't matter. The bell had learned to find them. And the figure began to appear more often, not just by the church, but near homes, watching from behind hedges, peeking through broken window panes. Reverend Mompesson kept to his vow. He did not flee. He wrote letters to neighboring clergy, describing not just the symptoms of the plague, but the dreams of a tall figure, of laughter that sounded like sobbing, of graves that moved. He wrote, "There is a presence here. It does not touch, it does not speak, but it knows us, it counts us. It tolls the bell long after our lungs have stilled." One by one, the letters stopped, and still, the bell rang. It felt too heavy, and when it rang, another villager died, even if they had shown no signs of illness the day before. Soon, the villagers stopped responding to the bell. They stayed inside, shuttered their windows, blocked their chimneys, whispered prayers into their bedding. But it didn't matter. The bell had learned to find them. And the figure began to appear more often, not just by the church, but near homes, watching from behind hedges, peeking through broken window panes. Reverend Mompesson kept to his vow. He did not flee. He wrote letters to neighboring clergy, describing not just the symptoms of the plague, but the dreams of a tall figure, of laughter that sounded like sobbing, of graves that moved. He wrote, "By the time dusk spilled its golden light over the village of Grafton Weald, the Langford sisters had grown bold in their investigation. Constance, with her linen satchel of notebooks, and Miriam, carrying the rusted lantern from the chapel vestry, moved silently through the vicarage garden. The whispering hedges and moss-choked statues seemed to sigh in warning, but the sisters did not hesitate. Their dreams had been plagued long enough. They needed answers. Their destination, the cellar. The old cellar door was half buried under creeping ivy and years of village forgetfulness. A thin set of stone stairs led downward, framed by crumbling brick. When Miriam pulled the door open, the hinges gave a long groan, as if exhaling something that had waited centuries. "It's colder here," Constance whispered. Her breath clouded. In the fading light, she clutched the silver locket around her neck, an heirloom from their grandmother. The lantern revealed stone walls wet with condensation. The air smelled of mildew, old coal, and something metallic. The cellar wasn't just for storage, it had been a place of purpose. That much was clear from the iron hooks embedded in the ceiling beams, the narrow grates in the wall, and the strange hairline cracks in the stone floor. Constance paused at the center of the room. "Do you hear that?" Miriam nodded slowly. A faint ringing, like a bell buried beneath the earth. The sound was rhythmic, soft tings that came and went. Always distant, always just underfoot. It was the same sound they had both heard in their dreams, echoing from the foot of their beds, growing louder each night. They found the source at the far end of the room. Behind a wine rack, Miriam uncovered a trapdoor, padlocked shut with a rusted chain. The floor around it was oddly blackened, as if scorched. Constance stepped forward, suddenly dizzy. "It's under there," Miriam hesitated. "What if it's not just a bell?" The next morning, the sisters brought tools. A crowbar, a hammer, gloves. Constance had consulted the church records. The vicarage was built over an older chapel long before the current parish church was constructed. And before that, it had been something else entirely. The records grew vague past 1612, pages torn. Ink smudged. With effort, they broke the chain. The trapdoor creaked upward. A stairwell descended into pitch black. The air rising from below was ice cold and dry, the kind that stole your voice and dried your eyes. They descended slowly, every step echoing. At the bottom, the room widened into a narrow stone crypt. Shelves lined with dust-covered relics and candles long burned out. But in the center stood a pedestal, its base inscribed with symbols neither sister recognized. On top of it, hanging from a delicate metal bracket, was a small silver bell. The rope that once rang it had long rotted away. Miriam approached. The bell was silent now. She reached out but paused. A child's voice echoed faintly, "Don't ring." Both sisters froze. There was no child there. Only darkness. Miriam slowly stepped back. Constance crouched to examine the pedestal. "These carvings, they're not just symbols," she said. "They're names, all women, all villagers. One of them, Eleanor Langford. Their grandmother. The sisters left the bell untouched that day. But the sound followed them. A change in the village that week. The vicar fell ill. He spoke in tongues, scrawled nonsense on hymn sheets. One of the church elders, Mr. Lafferty, disappeared altogether. Children in the village began waking with nosebleeds and strange dreams of bells, cellars, and a girl in white robes with no eyes. The Langford sisters became isolated. The villagers whispered about their nightly walks, the lanterns seen moving in the vicarage windows long after midnight. The grocer, Mrs. Hayward, began crossing the street to avoid them, but the sisters couldn't stop. They needed to know what their family had been part of. In the cellar, beneath the trapdoor, the bell was ringing again. Clearer this time. They returned that Sunday. Constance brought salt, Miriam matches, and a thin vial of holy water. When they descended, the bell began to sway gently, though no wind moved. With each swing, the carvings glowed faintly, and a low hum began to fill the space like distant chanting. Constance whispered the names. Each one grew louder in her head, until she reached Eleanor. The bell stopped. Then the pedestal cracked open. What lay beneath inside? The pedestal was a scroll, wax-sealed, bound in lambskin. They broke it open on the cellar floor. The script was in Latin, but they recognized enough to understand. In darkness, the bell tolls not for warning, but for invitation. Those who hear it belong already. Those who do not cannot be saved. And below that, the Langford line shall keep the bell shall keep the dead. The sisters stared at one another. In the corner of the room, something began to rise. A shape, humanoid, but translucent, cloaked in rotted lace. Its mouth opened, and the sound of the bell poured out. Miriam screamed. Constance grabbed the lantern, and threw it. The flame caught. The room filled with choking smoke and heat, but the bell did not burn. They fled. The next morning, the cellar was sealed, the vicarage locked, The Langford sisters left Grafton Weald and never returned. But sometimes on cold autumn nights, when the wind stirs the ivy around the old vicarage, villagers claim to hear a faint, silvery sound, ting, ting, a bell beneath the earth, still ringing and waiting. When the bell rang again on the third night, Joseph didn't wake with a jolt. He had been lying awake, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, waiting. The air was thick and damp, clinging to the walls and curling around his throat. He rose without, lighting a lantern, letting the faint, silvery glow from the bell window guide him. The village square was empty, save for a fine mist that shimmered like cobwebs in the moonlight. The bell tower loomed before him, motionless, as though mocking his fear. He stood beneath it, staring up at the dark hole where the bell should hang. There was no rope, no mechanism left to pull, and yet 3 nights in a row it had rung. "It wants something," said a voice behind him. Joseph turned quickly. Old Marla stood there, her shawl wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders, eyes cloudy but unblinking. The bell. It's not just a warning, it's a calling. He had heard the stories of Marla, that she'd been the last to see the bell ringer, alive decades ago, and that she'd once locked herself inside the church crypt for 3 days with no food or light. She was half feared, half forgotten. "Why is it calling me?" Joseph asked, the words tasting like rust. Marla's face twitched. "Because you're the only one who doesn't hear it with ears. You feel it, in your teeth, in your bones. It chose." Hugh. He wanted to laugh, but his mouth stayed closed. Somewhere deep in his chest, a silent truth buzzed like a trapped fly. He could no longer deny that the bell's toll echoed differently for him, not as a sound, but a vibration in the marrow. The next day, Joseph did not open the forge. Instead, he packed a satchel with bread, a flask of bitter tea, and a notebook. He returned to the tower by noon, climbed a spiral staircase that creaked like whispering voices, and sat just beneath the arch where the bell once hung. Nothing happened for hours. He scrawled notes, sketched symbols he half remembered from his grandfather's journals, and watched the clouds drift through the frame of the window. But as dusk settled, the light within the tower shifted. A glimmering began where the bell had once swung. At first, it resembled heat shimmer, transparent, wavy. But slowly, it gained shape, a faint outline like a mold made of moonlight and dust. Joseph stood. The air tightened around him. His teeth ached. A low pressure built in his head like altitude sickness. The shimmering bell, though not fully formed, began to vibrate. Bong. There was no sound, but the tower shook. A cloud of dust fell from the rafters. Joseph dropped to one knee, gasping. Bong. This time, the vibration struck his spine. Images flickered in his vision, not his own memories. A man in a long coat climbing the tower steps, a rusted key. Blood pooling under wooden floorboards. A small door beneath the belfry, sealed shut. Joseph crawled toward the back wall where his vision had pointed. He felt blindly until his hand struck iron. A latch. He pulled. A square of darkness yawned open in the floor, torch in hand. Joseph descended into the hidden chamber. The air was older than anything he'd breathed before, filled with the scent of mold, rust, and forgotten rituals. The chamber was small, circular, lined with stone shelves. On them sat objects: a cracked hourglass, a lock of hair in glass, a child's toy bell carved from bone. At the center of the floor was a circle drawn in chalk, or what he hoped was chalk. Inside the circle lay a metal box, shaped like a miniature coffin. Joseph stepped into the circle. Nothing happened. He picked up the box. It was warm. Back above ground, the phantom bell had vanished. Only silence remained, the true kind, not empty, but waiting. That night, in his forge, Joseph placed the box on his anvil. It resisted opening, not with a lock, but with intent. As though it only opened when it wanted to, he laid his hands flat on the lid. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. The lid creaked. A sliver opened. Inside were 4 items: a cracked mirror, a sliver of red crystal, a parchment with symbols written in ash, and a piece of a bell clapper, jagged and blackened. Joseph's breath caught. It was the clapper of the original bell. He didn't sleep that night. He studied the parchment, trying to match the ash glyphs with anything from his grandfather's library. Nothing made sense until dawn, when he saw the outline of a forged symbol tucked within the scribbles. It was a request, not just to rebuild the bell, to resurrect it. Over the following weeks, Joseph worked in secret. The bell frame still stood, waiting. He smelted ore with the red crystal as flux, forging metal that shimmered unnaturally in light and sang like a tuning fork when struck. As the new bell took shape, the air in the village shifted. People grew restless. Dreams became louder. A farmer slit his own ears with rusted shears, screaming that the bell's screaming wouldn't stop. Joseph said nothing. On the day of the bell's completion, fog rolled in so thick it choked the trees. He hoisted the bell into place using chains that hissed like steam. The clapper was the last piece. When he placed it inside the bell, the metal rang faintly of its own accord, a pulse, not a sound, then silence. That night, the bell rang once. Everyone heard it. Windows shattered, animals fled, candles extinguished on their own, and then silence returned. Joseph stood in the tower, next to the new bell. It shimmered faintly, as though half in this world and half in another. Marla appeared in the stairwell. "It's done," she said. "It is, and now it will call others." Joseph turned to her. "Why? What is it for?" Marla's eyes glistened. "Not warning, not alarm, a doorbell. The door's on our side. Now they know we're here." He understood too late. From beneath the floorboards, from the edges of windows, from the grain of the wood itself, whispers began, and then they answered the call. The fog never left the village of Elders Hollow. Weeks had passed since Margaret's disappearance, and the damp cold still clung to the thatched roofs and hung low over the twisted lanes like a curtain no hand could pull aside. Though the villagers had returned to their routines, none walked past the vicarage after dusk. Even the crows had found other places to perch. And yet, one thing remained untouched by time or fear: the locked door at the base of the old vicarage. Miss Bramble, the town schoolteacher, and perhaps the last person brave enough to ask questions, had started visiting the vicarage again. She never approached the house itself, but would stand at the garden's edge with her hands folded and eyes fixed on the foundation stones. She claimed she could hear breathing. "You think I'm mad," she whispered to Mr. Kent, the grocer, one morning. "But I swear to you, the ground moves like something is alive beneath it." He didn't argue. Everyone had heard something by now. The return of quiet things. Miss Bramble was not the only one drawn to the vicarage. At night, the Hollow's children began waking from the same dream: a door opening where no door should be, and something tall stepping out, dragging a bag behind it. Little Edward Morley had wet the bed 3 times in a week. He'd never done so before. "It asked for my name," he told his mother, eyes wide with fever. "And when I didn't give it, it said it already knew." Whispers spread. The villagers stopped speaking Margaret's name aloud. Some even suggested the vicarage be torn down. But who would do it? No hammer dared strike those walls. Not after what happened to John Felder. John, a carpenter with too much drink in him, had tried prying open the vicarage door with a crowbar. He'd vanished before he could swing a second time. The next day, his boots were found neatly placed outside his cottage, but inside, nothing. No clothes, no furniture, no dust, not even the smell of wood. The door opens. It was nearly the end of November when it happened. Just past the last frost, when the trees were nothing but bone and the wind had grown sharp with winter's promise. That night, The hollow's moon rose blue. Miss Bramble, sleepless and stirred by a strange rustling outside, dressed herself and walked down the hill, past shuttered windows and darkened hearths. Something guided her. Not a voice, but a certainty. She wasn't alone. At the vicarage gate stood 5 others: the blacksmith, the schoolboy whose brother vanished last spring, an elderly woman who'd long stopped speaking, and 2 dogs who whimpered but did not run. The door was open. Not the front, not the cellar. Door that had never existed, in the stone wall beneath the vicarage, where no one had ever seen hinges or a frame. And now it stood wide, revealing a narrow stair curling down into thick blackness. The villagers stood motionless. Something came. Up. They didn't see it. They felt it, a presence, old as soil and slow as rot. Miss Bramble's knees buckled. The dogs whined, but the stair remained empty. Then, a knock from inside. As if the door had turned itself and something knocked from within the village. Then, again, a pause, and then the door closed, just like that, gone, as if it had never been there. The wall was once again seamless stone, and the mist rolled in thicker than ever. The letter 2 days later. Every household in Elders Hollow received an envelope. No stamps, no handwriting. Just thick yellowed parchment sealed with wax. Inside. A name. Each letter had only one, different in every envelope. Miss Bramble's read. Yours was the last kindness. The boys said. Do not return to the stream. The blacksmith wept when he read his. No one spoke of the letters. No one dared compare. But that morning, the vicarage door was gone. Not boarded. Not broken. Gone. As if the house had healed itself and erased all trace of entry. Yet the foundation stones were damp, freshly laid. Something had been disturbed. The waiting, even now, years later, Elders Hollow remains. A beautiful village, tucked away in maps no longer printed, found only by accident or invitation. The fog is thinner now, but it never leaves. Children still whisper stories of the vanished vicarage, though no building stands at the end of Bell Road, and every so often, in the middle of the night, someone hears a knock, 2 soft raps on an unseen door. Always from the floorboards, always beneath the hearth. Those who hear it never stay, and those who stay never speak of it, but they all remember Margaret, and they all remember the door. It's still waiting, just like it always was. You awaken to the sound of a bell, not the sharp, ceremonial clang of a city tower, nor the pleasant toll of a church wedding, but a low, dragging, mournful ring. It echoes off the green hillsides, caught between stone cottages and lichen-covered graveyards. The year is 1666. The village is Ayham, nestled in Derbyshire, England, and the bell isn't calling anyone to prayer. It's warning them to stay away. This is not a story of mass death in one night. This is a story of slow dread, of a plague that crept between thatched walls and through cracks in limestone, taking one villager at a time over 14 months. A village that chose to trap itself with the disease, so the world outside could survive. The arrival, one parcel, many graves. It began, as horror often does, with something ordinary. A box of cloth arrived from London in August 1665, addressed to the local tailor. The city was already infected with plague, but this little village of Ayham had been untouched so far. The cloth had been damp. To freshen it, the tailor's assistant hung it near the hearth. By the following week, he was dead. Then the tailor. Then the tailor's neighbors. The village priest's record from that month reads, within the week, the boy coughed blood. There were boils, fever like burning oil. His skin turned the color of rotten milk. I buried him before his body cooled. They thought it might pass quickly, but it didn't. The death slowed, but never stopped. Instead, they hovered. 1 here, 2 next week, a lull. Then 3 in a single day. Panic simmered like a slow stew over the fire. And then, the decision was made. A village's impossible vow. The priest, Reverend William Mompesson, and his predecessor, Thomas Stanley, both convinced the villagers of Ayam to do something unthinkable, to quarantine themselves voluntarily. No one would leave, no one would enter, not for food nor medicine, nor escape. They marked the village boundary with stones, some still visible today, and asked traders to leave food and supplies there. Payment was left in vinegar-filled holes in the rock, believed to disinfect the coins. People who heard the story laughed at first. A peasant's tale, they said. They'll flee soon enough. But the people of Ayam didn't flee, even when their children died, even when their homes stank of the dead, even when the hillside graves multiplied like flies. A horror measured in footsteps. Imagine this. You wake in the dark to the sound of someone digging. It's your neighbor burying his daughter. He will not ask for help. He dares not. By day, the fields lie silent. The sheep go untended. The bread oven in the village center remains cold. Some villagers try to pray. Others weep quietly. But some, and this is where the story shifts, hear the bell. The one not rung by priest or hand. Several villagers, according to oral accounts, claimed they began to hear a slow tolling bell at night, a sound no one else could hear. First one toll, then two, then silence. Each time, the person who heard the bell would fall sick within days. They called it the death bell, the bell that called no one. No church in Ayam rang a bell during the plague months, not out of neglect, but out of fear. The tower rope could spread the disease. The congregation was gone, yet multiple letters and journal entries describe a sound like a bell underwater, or a faint tolling from beyond the edge of the woods. The priest's daughter, Catherine, is said to have heard it the night before she died. She had no fever, no signs. She went to sleep with a smile. By morning, her lips were blue and her pulse gone. The bell never appeared again until someone else heard it. Signs carved in wood. One cottage in Ayam, now called Plague Cottage, bore strange carvings discovered decades later when it was dismantled. For repairs. On one oak beam, beneath soot and layers of lath, was scratched, "Bell for 3, bell for me. Hear it once, you may be free. Hear it twice, it rings no more." Local historians dismissed it as a child's rhyme, likely added in the 1800s to embellish a folk story. But when carbon testing dated the wood panel to 1666, they reconsidered. Was it written by a survivor or a victim? No one knows. The grave behind the house, one of the most unsettling graves in Ayam, is not in the cemetery. It's behind a small cottage near the edge of the old village line. A single marker, a flat, rough stone, reads, "Here lies one who rang the bell." No name, no date, no cross, only that chilling phrase. Local legend says the man buried there was deaf, yet insisted he had heard the bell all the same. "It rang for me," he told his wife, days before vomiting blood and dying in the barn. Why would a deaf man claim to hear a bell? And why did the villagers bury him apart? You've stepped into a village frozen in dread, not a scream-filled panic, but a slow, grim silence, where children drew lines in the dirt to mark where the healthy could walk, where families buried their dead in their gardens, where a community stayed inside the gates of death, by choice. But still, one question haunts these mossy stone paths and sloping graveyards. Was the death bell just a sound of fear, or something far older, that chose Ayam to ring once more? The sickness spread like fog after rain. Within weeks of George Vickers' death, other homes in Ayam began falling silent. Entire cottages were shuttered, curtains drawn. No smoke from chimneys. The signs were always the same: a sudden fever, aching limbs, dark swellings along the neck and groin. Then silence. Ayam was still, but not peaceful. The kind of stillness that crept under doorways and settled behind your ribs. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but full of waiting. Reverend William Mompesson stood at the doorway. of his parsonage, watching as a cart rattled down the lane, a single body wrapped in linen across its boards. He was a tall man with a stern face, yet his eyes bore the weariness of someone who had seen too much and feared what still lay ahead. A week earlier, he had buried his own maid. Now he prepared to dig deeper into both the earth and his conscience. The villagers turned to him for answers. But there were no sermons that could stop the plague. No psalms that could quiet the sobs behind closed doors. What Mompesson proposed instead, on a chilled morning as gray clouds pressed low, was not salvation, but sacrifice. He addressed the people of Ayam in the graveyard, near the lichen-covered yew tree that had stood for centuries, longer than the church, longer than memory. Men and women came in silence, faces hollow, scarves over their mouths. Children clutched at skirts. Crows perched in the branches above, unusually still. We must think not only of ourselves, Mompesson began, voice low, steady, but of those beyond this valley, Bakewell, Sheffield, the Peak District. If we allow the sickness to leave, we carry death to hundreds more. A murmur passed through the gathered crowd. You ask us to stay? A blacksmith asked. His knuckles were white around the handle of his cap. Even as our families die? I ask you to be the wall, Mompesson said. We can choose fear, or we can choose purpose. Let our suffering be the end of it. It was madness, some thought. A death sentence painted with holy words. And yet no one left. The villagers agreed. Perhaps it was faith. Perhaps it was duty. Perhaps it was that strange resignation that comes when you realize you are already living beside death, and there is nowhere left to run. The isolation pact began quietly. Boundary stones were placed at the outer edges of the village, worn. Rocks from the hills, carved with small notches to mark the corners of Ayam's invisible cage. Coins were left in drilled holes in the stone, soaking in vinegar as crude payment for food or medicine dropped off by nearby villagers. No contact was allowed. No crossing permitted. At first, it worked. Provisions came. No one outside the village fell ill. The summer sun softened the fear, and hope crept in like a timid guest. But then the deaths accelerated. The village became a place of whispers. People spoke only through closed doors or from across gardens. Children no longer played. The market square emptied. The plague didn't just take bodies, it took voices, movement, color. Some villagers buried their own dead in gardens. Others left the bodies wrapped at the church gate, too weak or afraid to say goodbye properly. The ground grew heavy with sorrow. The air heavier still. And then the bell began to ring. It started one night, late in August. Mompesson was in the chapel, praying by candlelight, when he heard the toll. A single chime, slow, distant, full of weight. He froze. The bell rope hung beside him, still. He ran outside, heart pounding. The streets were empty. Only the sound of leaves stirring. The next morning, several others claimed to have heard it. But no one had touched the bell. No one admitted to it. The bell ringer had died 3 days prior. They began to call it the plague bell. Not the one in the church, but the other, the unseen one. The one that seemed to sound when no one was watching. It didn't ring every day. Only when someone died alone. Only when a child was taken in their sleep. Only when a whole household vanished behind their walls. Mompesson did not speak of it in sermons, but he began to mark the times it rang, and soon realized it always came before the death was known. As though it already knew. By autumn, the village had become unrecognizable. Grass grew between cobblestones. Doors were nailed shut with crude crosses carved into the wood. The apothecary's windows were broken, the forge cold, the school empty. People rarely left their homes unless absolutely necessary. They walked with scarves soaked in herbs, avoided eye contact, refused to touch anything they hadn't brought from home. Yet despite every precaution, death still found its way in, slipping under door cracks, hiding in apples, clinging to. Letters passed between family members. Some villagers blamed rats. Others blamed God. A few blamed each other. There were whispers about old Mr. Hadley, who continued to roam the village each morning with his cane, muttering to himself and knocking on doors with a strange tune. When someone asked what he was doing, he simply replied, "I'm checking who's next." He was always right. Others spoke of the well near the orchard that had gone bitter. The birds stopped drinking from it. A little girl named Anne told her mother she saw a woman floating just beneath the water, but when they checked, it was clear, except the water was warm and smelled faintly of lavender. The most feared place became the churchyard. At first, families gathered there together, keeping distance but still sharing hymns, prayer, even small nods of comfort. But by October, it was silent. Too many graves. Too many shallow mounds of earth. The bell tolled again on a frost-bitten morning. A child's voice, some claimed, crying out between the chimes. Mompesson stood alone beneath the yew tree, listening. Was this still the voice of plague? Or had something else taken root in Am? Autumn bled into winter. The leaves that had once blazed red and gold now lay brown and sodden on the ground, turning to sludge beneath the boots of the few villagers still strong enough to walk. Am had become a village of whispers and shallow breaths. The laughter of children had long vanished. Church hymns were replaced by the shuffling of footsteps and the soft thump of freshly dug graves. And still, the bell tolled, but it wasn't always rung by human hands. One night, under a sickle moon, young Alice Hadley, barely 13 and already orphaned, heard the bell toll at midnight, but no one had died that day. She had watched. Everyone left in the village was accounted for. Curious, she crept barefoot through the frost-touched grass toward the bell tower, her candle trembling in the wind. The church stood dark and locked, yet the bell above swayed gently, chiming low and clear in the silence. Alice wasn't the only one who had heard it. Widow Fletcher, whose 3 sons lay side by side in the churchyard, stepped out from her cottage, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Behind her, Thomas Rowe, the gravedigger, once silent and stoic, now hollow-eyed and pale, emerged too, blinking as if waking from a nightmare. No one spoke. They simply stood beneath the tower, listening. That was the first night they saw it. Figure, impossibly tall and thin, cloaked in darkness, stepped out from the church's side door, though no one had opened it. Its face was hidden beneath a veil of soot-colored mist. As it walked, the sound of dry leaves crumbling followed its steps. Alice would later describe its hands as too long, with fingers like burnt twigs. Others, those who dared to speak of it, said it smelled like old metal and rot. Some called it the Watcher. Others believed it was death itself only. It had lost its way in Am and now lingered, confused, drawn by the village's strange choice to embrace its own demise. From that night on, the bell tolled at random. Sometimes just before dawn, sometimes in the heart of the afternoon. Always when the fog was thickest. Always when the silence felt too heavy. And when it rang, another villager died, even if they had shown no signs of illness the day before. Soon, the villagers stopped responding to the bell. They stayed inside, shuttered their windows, blocked their chimneys, whispered prayers into their bedding. But it didn't matter. The bell had learned to find them. And the figure began to appear more often, not just by the church, but near. Homes, watching from behind hedges, peeking through broken window panes. Reverend Mompesson kept to his vow. He did not flee. He wrote letters to neighboring clergy, describing not just the symptoms of the plague, but the dreams of a tall figure, of laughter that sounded like sobbing, of graves that moved. He wrote, "There is a presence here. It does not touch, it does not speak, but it knows us, it counts us. It tolls the bell long after our lungs have stilled." One by one, the letters stopped. And still, the bell rang. The summer of 1666 crawled on. Ayam was no longer a village. It was a graveyard disguised as one, still and heavy, like the air before a storm. By now, entire families had perished, their cottages sealed from the inside, windows dark, gardens overgrown. The roads, once bustling with carts and chatter, echoed only with the creak of empty shutters and the occasional moan of wind pushing through crumbling walls. And yet, the bell tower still stood, tall and grim above the rows of moss-covered graves. At first, it had been told by the living, one slow ring for each death, a mournful rhythm that mapped out the village's descent into silence. But now, there was no one left to ring it. The bell rope, frayed and stiff with mildew, hung unmoved in the church's drafty interior. Dust choked the pews. Rats had made their homes beneath the altar, and yet, the bell rang at odd hours, in the dead of night. Once, twice sometimes, a full dozen tolls in a row, measured, deliberate, cold. Reverend Mompesson was the first to hear it. One stormy night, as he prayed alone in his cottage, his wife dead, his children sick, the sound of the bell drifted over the rooftops. Low, metallic, soaked in sorrow, he knew the bell. He had rung it with his own hands too many times. But this toll was wrong. It had a strange wet resonance to it, as though rung by something that remembered neither rhythm nor reverence. The next morning, he climbed the tower. There was no one there. The rope was untouched, still tied in the same stiff knot. Dust lay thick across the wooden floor. And yet, the sound had been real. He could feel its echo deep in his bones. He did not speak of it. Not at first, but then others began to hear it too. Children who had survived whispered of a voice inside. The bell's toll, not words exactly, but something like a breath. A hunger, a call. The villagers began to keep records, not of the dead, but of the bell. They wrote down the time it rang, the number of tolls, the weather, even the direction. The wind blew, a pattern emerged. Always after dusk. Always after someone had died, but sometimes it tolled before anyone knew they were sick. It was as if the bell anticipated the plague. Or worse, invited it. Some claimed it didn't just ring anymore. It spoke. One widow, mad with grief, was found outside the church with her ear pressed against the bell tower's stone wall. Her eyes wide open, lips moving silently. When Reverend Mompesson pulled her away, she whispered only one word before collapsing. Below. She died thee. Next morning, her face frozen in a silent scream. No one dared enter the tower again. But the bell rang on. And then the dreams began. The summer of 1667 arrived, bright and green, as if the land itself had forgotten what it endured. The birds returned to the hedgerows, and the wildflowers once again stretched their colors across the meadows. Rain came and went. The sun no longer felt like punishment, but Ayam remained changed. Only a handful of villagers survived. Their numbers had dwindled from over 350 to fewer than 80. These were not the same people who had stood at the churchyard 1 year earlier and vowed to seal themselves in. Their faces were hollow, their voices quiet, and in their eyes lived memories that refused to die. Among them was Alice Hadfield, the widow who had buried her husband and all 4 children with her own trembling hands. She no longer wept. She no longer spoke. But sometimes at dusk, she would sit beside the field where the old bell once hung, and tilt her head. Listening. There was no bell in Ayam anymore. The rope had snapped months ago, and the iron clapper had long since rusted into silence. No one dared repair it, and yet, villagers claimed they still heard it. Not in the air, but in their bones. Children who had never stepped inside the church would wake screaming, clutching their ears, swearing they heard the tolling. Dogs refused to go near the churchyard. Birds circled wide around it. And late at night, if one stood very still in the narrow lane behind the bakery, they said you could hear it, a single, slow ring, as though death had forgotten something and come back for it. The bell They whispered, had never stopped. It had become something else now. Not a sound, but a presence. A weight pressing behind the eyes. A cold breath down the neck of a survivor. A memory no one wanted, but none could escape. And so they began to leave, one by one, quietly, with only what they could carry. No farewells, no goodbyes. They walked away from Am, through the stone gateposts, past the sheep fields, down the winding paths that once brought traders and travelers. Some walked to Sheffield, others vanished into the forests. But no one ever spoke of where they went. Those who remained were not quite the same. The village became quiet, not in mourning, but in retreat, as if the earth itself had closed its mouth. The church was shuttered, the bell tower left untouched. Its moss-covered frame bent slightly, like a spine too weary to stand straight. Decades passed, new people came. They were told the story, how the village had sacrificed itself to save the world. A noble tale, a holy one. But at night, even they admitted, something watched from the hills, something ancient, something patient. And sometimes, when the wind was just right and the moon sat full above the churchyard, even the newcomers heard it, a slow, sorrowful toll, not metal on metal, but time on memory, loss on the soul. The bell of Am never stopped. It simply sank deeper, into the roots, the stones, the stories, waiting. The centuries have passed, and yet the village of Am still breathes with memory. Time has weathered its stones and softened its pain, but the stories buried in the earth have not quieted. They stir like roots beneath the soil, unseen but alive. Today, Am is a quiet place. Stone cottages with low roofs cluster along winding lanes, framed by dry stone walls that have stood for hundreds of years. Ivy creeps over windowsills, and sheep graze idly on the surrounding hills. It's a village like any other in the Derbyshire Dales until you stop. Until you listen. Visitors come for the history. Some are curious, some are reverent. A few simply wander in by chance, unaware of what they are walking through. They might pass by the boundary stones, still resting at the edge of the village. The same stones that once marked the border of life and death, where outsiders left bread and medicine. In vinegar-filled crevices, those who know the story pause there, some placing a hand on the cool rock, as if trying to understand the invisible line that once separated the doomed from the saved. Farther into the village, small plaques mark homes where the plague struck hardest. Outside the cottage of the Thorpe family, tourists read about the mother who buried her own children. At the churchyard, moss-covered headstones lean awkwardly, names nearly erased by time and weather. Yet the weight of those names is still felt. One of the most visited sites is the Riley Grave's 7 simple mounds on a windswept hill, where Elizabeth Hancock buried her husband and 6 children with her own hands. She survived, she stayed, when so many would have fled. Her story is not one of horror, but of unimaginable strength. And then there is the bell. Some say it's just a tale, passed down to give texture to ghost stories. Others say they've heard it once, twice maybe. More, a soft, slow tolling that seems to come from nowhere. Not the church bell, long since replaced, but something older, deeper. It's always at night. Always when the fog is low and the village is asleep. The sound doesn't echo like a real bell would. It hums through the bones, through the soil, through the air itself. Those who have heard it describe an odd stillness that falls right before. As if the world takes a breath, animals quiet, wind ceases. Even the stars seem to hold their twinkle. Then it comes, dong. A pause, dong. The first time it was heard in the modern era was by a postman walking the route alone just before dawn. He stopped, turned, and waited. But there was no one. No church nearby. No explanation. Another account came from a local woman who had just lost her mother. Unable to sleep, she wandered through the village at 2 a.m., drawn toward the churchyard. There, in the mist, she heard the bell. Faint but steady. It rang 6 times. The next day, she visited the village archives, unsure why the number mattered. There, she found that 6 people from her own family had died in the plague. Coincidence, perhaps. Or something more. Old letters stored in the local church reveal that even in the years after the plague, villagers reported hearing bells when no bell tower was manned. A priest once wrote, "I have laid stones across the bell rope, but still it tolls. Let it be known that no hand guides it." Some believe the bell was never buried, but that its sound is a memory and echo that lives in the land. Others say the last infected man, the one buried deep in the woods outside Ayam, still wears the bell around his neck. That his body was never found, only the rope, frayed and empty. Whatever the truth, the legend endures. But perhaps the most haunting thing about Ayam is not the bell, or the death, or the silence. It is the choice they made. The villagers chose to suffer, to die, so that others might live. In a world consumed by fear, they chose sacrifice. No walls were built, no one forced them. They looked inward and stayed. That kind of courage leaves a scar. A quiet, noble scar etched deep into the identity of a place. Today, when the wind moves just right through the narrow lanes, you can almost hear it, not the bell, but something subtler. A hush, a reverence, as if the village itself remembers and refuses to forget. So what remains in Ayam? Stones, stories, silence. And perhaps on certain nights, the soft toll of a bell that no one ever sees. A final whisper from a village that once stood still, so the world could keep moving. If you walk through Ayam at dusk, walk gently, for here the dead are not forgotten, and sometimes they ring the bell. Black Hollow was not always a forgotten village. Once it was a stopover for traveling merchants, a place where weary men tied up their horses and warmed themselves in the smoke-thick tavern by the square. Children scraped frost off cottage windows to watch passing carts, and women stitched wool beside fireplaces that snapped and whispered with every gust of wind outside. It was quiet, poor, and hardy, but it was alive. Then came the long winters. They grew worse each year, colder, deeper, more stubborn. The roads turned to ice by late autumn. Wolves crept down from the pines. Crops failed in the stony soil. People left. A few stayed, then more died. The woods thickened as if they wanted to reclaim what humans had taken. And the last thing to remain untouched was the stone well in the village center. No one alive remembered who built it. No name was carved in the stone. No date, no saint, no emblem of Rome or any known kingdom. It was as if it had always been there, and it was deep. So deep that a tossed pebble took several long heartbeats before the sound of splash echoed back. It was always cold, always dark, and some whispered, not always empty. It began, as these stories do, with a child. Her name was Elsie, 10 years old. Moved to Black Hollow with her uncle, Roran, after her parents died of winter fever. Roran was the village blacksmith, quiet, strong, with hands like tree bark and eyes that never looked far beyond the present. He took her in, gave her food, told her one rule: don't go near the well after the first snowfall. She didn't ask why. She was a good child. But children do not always stay good, especially when the snow muffles every footstep, and the world feels distant and slow. The snow came early that year, before All Hallows. It was a thick, silencing snow, and on the 7th night of frost, Elsie woke up to a sound. A strange, hollow sound that seemed to echo from outside her window. She slipped on her boots, pulled on her cloak. The door creaked open with the groan of an old tree, and the cold hit her like breath from a crypt. But she followed the sound anyway. She found herself standing beside the stone lip of the old well. The frost hadn't touched its surface. The fingu. Bricks were slick with black moisture. And the sound, it was still there. It wasn't wind. It wasn't water. It was her name. Elsie ... whispered low, slow, like breath traveling up through stone and ice. She ran back inside. Her feet tracked snow into the house. She didn't tell Roran. She didn't sleep. The next morning, Roran went to draw water, and the bucket came up crimson. Not thick like blood, thinner, like something had bled into the water slowly, drip by drip, for hours. He said nothing. He burned the rope, built a new one, and that night, when the wind howled louder than ever before, Elsie told him the truth. She told him the well had called her name. The frost came early that year. It whispered across the fields like a warning, silvering the last leaves before they fell. Sheep froze where they stood. Chickens refused to lay. And by November, the ground in Lindidiu had hardened to stone. But inside each home, the true cold began elsewhere. Rhiannon Pooh was the first to speak of it aloud. She lived alone in a stone cottage near the lake's edge, widowed 10 years, and known for her sharp tongue. One evening, she burst into the small chapel mid-sermon, clutching her shawl like armor. "Something is watching me," she gasped. "It stands by the window every night. A woman in white." They said she was mad with loneliness. Until 2 days later, her body was found stiff in her chair, eyes frozen open, frost curling across the walls behind her. From that day on, others in the village began to whisper women in white. Specters seen through cracked windows, just standing, not moving, not blinking, not walking toward you, only watching, always outside, always just before a death. By December, 5 more widows were dead, not sick, not harmed, just gone, as if the life inside them had quietly drained away during the night, their homes coated with a strange hoarfrost. No fire could melt it. No breath would fog the air within. Father Elwyn, a former soldier turned priest, tried to comfort the villagers. "Grief," he said. "It chills the bones and clouds the mind. These visions are born from sorrow." But even he could not explain the footprints, barefoot, narrow, delicate, that crunched into the snow outside each widow's house and never came back out. Ira Evans, young and newly married, began to sleep with her windows nailed shut and salt beneath the sill. Her husband scoffed, but she knew the stories. Her grandmother had told them, in whispers, always in winter, of the lake that never thawed, of the widows who once walked into its depths and never returned, and of the way the dead sometimes come back when they are not remembered properly. The elders warned her not to repeat those tales, but Ira remembered something else too. When the lake froze over that year, it was not smooth. It was jagged, with shapes beneath the ice. Shapes that looked like faces, mouths open in silence. Something was stirring beneath the frost. As the year clawed its way into deep winter, Lindidiu became quieter, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the breathless, heavy silence of a place holding itself still. Even the crows had stopped cawing. No one dared walk by the lake after sunset. Not because of wolves, they were long gone, but because of what was seen in the shimmer of moonlight on the frozen water. Shadows, feminine, standing still, draped in white dot and in the snow. More of those narrow, bare footprints appeared, always leading toward a widow's home. Never away, Ira Evans was one of the few who still ventured out during daylight. Her husband, Di, mocked her whispered prayers and bowls of black salt. But even he could not deny what they'd found on their doorstep one morning, a single white glove, stiff with frost, folded neatly. No tracks leading to it, no explanation, just the glove, as if left in offering. Or warning, Di burned it in the hearth. But the fire cracked unnaturally loud, like something protesting. That night, the frost crept in through the walls. Literally, they watched as delicate veins of ice etched across the stone, across the window panes, and worst of all, across their bed frame. Ira woke gasping, her breath a thick mist. Di didn't wake. He never would again. His face was peaceful. Too peaceful. as if he'd been taken before he could feel fear. The doctor from the next village came in a horse-drawn sled to examine him. "No signs of illness," he murmured, running gloved fingers across the rim of the hearth. "But what's this?" He held up. Something pale, a white sliver. Fingernail? No, it shimmered. Almost translucent, frozen skin. After Dai's burial, Ira began to speak with the other women, quietly at first. In kitchens, under flickering candlelight. Not just the widows, but their daughters, their nieces, their cousins. They shared the same stories out of dreams where hands pressed coldly to their cheeks, of humming heard at night, a lullaby no one had sung in generations, of their doors being found slightly ajar come morning, no matter how tightly they were bolted. None of the men believed them, until they too began to vanish, not into the woods, not with noise or struggle, but simply gone, leaving behind steamless tea and half-written letters. The only trace? That lingering frost. The priest, Father Elwin, grew desperate. He called for the bishop, sent letters with the mail cart. No reply came. Then one morning, the cart was found tipped over just outside the village, the driver's clothes folded neatly beside it, the horses untouched, his boots still laced inside them. The priest gathered the remaining villagers into the church. Candles lit every pew. The warmth of their flicker made the cold feel even colder. He told them what few wanted to hear. This is not the work of madness or misfortune. This is a haunting, and not by single spirits, but by something deeper, collective, tied to this land, this lake, something ... betrayed. And then he told them what he'd found in the archives. More than a century ago, during a famine, a group of women in Lindidu had gone to the elders of the village and begged for permission to fish the lake, a practice forbidden by ancient superstition. The elders said no. The women pleaded. Their children were starving. In the end, they defied the council and fished anyway. When the harvest came in the following spring and the famine lifted, the village declared the women blasphemers. Not only had they broken a sacred custom, they had stolen from the lake, which the old lore considered a sleeping mirror where the past and future met. The women, 16 of them, most of them widows, were taken in the night, weighted with stones, and dragged beneath the lake's surface. That winter, the lake froze completely for the first time in recorded history. And now it had frozen again. Ira didn't sleep that night. She sat with a kettle warming over the hearth and listened. Nothing. No wind. No owls. Only the faintest sound, like the dragging of fabric across ice. By morning, her porch was blanketed with frost roses, delicate ice blossoms that should not form at that temperature. She opened the door with trembling hands. There, standing at the edge of the path, were 3 women. They didn't move. Their hair was long and white, but their faces were not aged, just ... empty. Their eyes did not blink. They wore no shoes, the same narrow feet, and in one of their hands, a piece of Ira's shawl, stolen weeks ago when it had gone missing from the washing line. Ira backed into her home and slammed the door. But they didn't come in. They didn't need to. That night, she dreamed of cold hands wrapping around her shoulders, not violently, but like a mother pulling a child close. The hum returned, deep and echoing, and the frost no longer felt like a threat. It felt like morning, a great sadness wide as the lake. The next day, she walked to the chapel. It was empty. No priest, no candles, just a frost-laced altar, and on its surface, a sheet of ice. Beneath it, barely visible, was a face, not Elwin's, a woman's, young, eyes closed. And when Ira touched the ice, she heard the voices. They did not speak in words, but memories, grief, hunger, fire, water. Then she understood. The women of the lake were not seeking revenge. They were seeking witness. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted someone to feel their cold so their warmth could return. She took a candle from the chapel and walked to the lake. Its surface was beginning to crack, not with heat, but with movement. Shapes were pressing. Up from beneath, Ira lit the candle and placed it on the ice. The frost drew back, just slightly, enough to show a face looking up. And then another. One by one, the ice released its hold. Not melting, but breaking. Softly, reverently. And as the candle burned, the women began to fade from the village, no longer standing outside windows, no longer pressing cold air into warm homes they had been seen. Epilogue. Candles on the ice. To this day, locals in nearby towns whisper of Linddu. They say no one lives there now. The village is a ghost of itself. But on the coldest night of the year, if you travel to its edge, you might see something. Not phantoms. Not horror. Just a line of candles, gently flickering on the frozen lake. And under the surface faces. Not screaming. Not angry. Just watching. Waiting for the warmth of memory. The storm that had brewed outside had lost its voice by morning. But inside the seminary, the air remained thick like a hush after something unspoken had passed between old walls. Nobody said it aloud, but they all felt it. Something had changed. The chapel's brass cross had tilted slightly on its pedestal. The morning bell had rung 4 minutes late, without any hand pulling the rope. And none of the candles would light during breakfast. Martin sat at the edge of his cot, staring at the worn leather cover of the gray book he had recovered from the library's sealed archives. The pages had changed overnight. Where there had been a blank space on the 32nd page, now there was a diagram hand-drawn in what looked like iron gall ink of a door. A door with no frame, no latch. Just a line of script curling around its arched top. Knew not the wall until the way was sought. He ran his fingers over the parchment. It was old centuries, possibly, but the ink felt fresh to the touch. That evening, after evensong, Martin returned to the restricted wing of the library. He'd studied the diagram all day between Latin translation and liturgy review. He knew now where it was pointing. Not a metaphorical door, not allegorical, real. Down the hall where the shelves stopped being alphabetized, past the globe with the oceans inked in ochre, and behind the painting of St. Emilianus. The painting had always unnerved him. The saint's eyes didn't quite match. But now he realized the bricks behind him weren't quite bricks. He returned with a lamp. The oil inside it was low, but it would last enough for one inspection. Carefully lifting the painting aside, Martin brushed dust from the wall. His heart was thudding now. Beneath the grime, there was indeed a crack, an arched line. In the stone that had been hidden beneath centuries of lime wash, he pressed his hand against it. Nothing. But then he remembered the phrase. Knew not the wall until the way was sought. He whispered it. The air changed. A sound like fabric being torn slowly vibrated through the floor. The bricks shifted, a shimmer, not of stone, but memory. The wall vanished. In its place, the door. From the drawing stood, barely 6 feet tall, without hinge or handle. Just the arch, and the whisper of something waiting. Martin should have left then. But curiosity had grown beyond him. He stepped through. The space beyond wasn't a room. It was between rooms. A corridor that curved impossibly, rising and falling like a wave frozen in time. Every surface was smooth stone, but not made by human hands. There were no torches, yet everything was lit by a dim bluish glow that pulsed in rhythm with his own breath. At intervals, he passed openings, rooms set like alcoves in a spiral. Some were empty. Others had remnants. A tarnished bishop's crozier. A single child's shoe. An extinguished candle still dripping wax as if freshly snuffed. And in one room he paused. There, resting atop a block of ash-colored marble, was another gray book. But this one was open, and it was writing itself. Ink flowed from no pen, forming lines of text in tight, curling script. Latin first, then English. The keeper reads not to learn, but to remember. What he learns, he returns. What he returns, he forgets. As Martin read, the words faded. He reached for the book. Suddenly, from deep within the corridor, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, echoing, deliberate. He stepped back into the curved hallway, holding the book to his chest. The air shifted again. Cold, then hot. He squinted into the darkness ahead there. A figure was walking toward him. The man wore the robes of an old bishop, hood low over his face, his mitre jagged and moth-eaten. His hands were bone-pale, and in one, he carried a chain with keys that clicked together as he moved. He did not look up. Martin turned and fled. But the corridor had changed. The curve now led downward, spiraling deeper, the air growing heavy. With each step, he passed rooms that no longer held curious relics, but people. Not moving, not breathing. Some in habits, others in student robes like his own. All seated, as if waiting. Each with a gray book open before them, pages blank. Martin slowed. One of them, a boy not much older than him, had his eyes open. They tracked Martin's movement, and then, slowly, the boy smiled. When Martin finally burst back through the door, it sealed behind him with a crack that echoed into silence. The painting of Saint Aemilianus fell flat against the floor. Dust curled upward. The lantern had gone out. He lay there, gasping. He had taken the second gray book with him. It was empty now. The next day, he tried to explain to Father Isidore. The priest listened quietly, hands folded, eyes calm. "Son," he said gently, "there is no painting of Saint Aemilianus in the library." Martin protested. He returned to the wall, but there was nothing. No sign of the arch or the hidden corridor, just solid brick. And on the floor where the painting had fallen, nothing. Except a tiny scrap of paper, half burned, with only one word still legible: remember. That night, Martin couldn't sleep. The book he had brought back was now gone from his satchel, but on his nightstand sat a different one, a new gray book. Its cover was cold to the touch, and somewhere, just beyond the walls of the seminary, a bell rang once. The candle was supposed to go out. Eleanor watched from across the old parlor, where dust lay thick on the velvet curtains, and the air still smelled faintly of lavender oil and ashes. The flame danced steadily on the mantel, blue at its base, tall and thin like it had something to prove. She had snuffed it twice already. Once with a silver candle snuffer shaped like a thimble, and once with her bare fingers, daring to feel the heat just to prove it was real. But both times, after moments of smothered darkness, the wick sputtered back to life, flickering defiantly in the gloom. Father Danvers, now pale and noticeably shaken, stood beside her. His hand clutched the Bible tighter than before. The book now bore smudges of soot and faint fingerprints, as if someone with cold blackened hands had turned the pages the night before. "Don't touch it again," he warned, his voice hoarse. That candle was placed there by her, by Madeline. Eleanor stared at the flame. "But Madeline's been dead for 18 years, he finished. "And she died in this room." The wind outside howled through the crooked eaves. The shadows on the wall danced as the flame pulsed with a strange, quiet rhythm, as if breathing. The story of Madeline Witcher. She was the daughter of the vicar before Father Danvers. Her name had rarely been mentioned in parish records, though Eleanor had found her mentioned once in the footnotes of a funeral sermon, marked only as the girl of great sadness. Eleanor had pieced together more of Madeline's story through whispered gossip and one yellowing diary found under the floorboards of the sacristy. Madeline had been sickly and silent, a girl who wandered the chapel long after services were over, murmuring hymns to herself as if speaking to someone just beyond sight. Some claimed she saw angels. Others said she conversed with things that shouldn't have been in any house of God. One stormy autumn night, the vicarage caught fire. Not a blaze, no. Flames, no smoke, just heat and light. A glow from within the house that terrified onlookers, but left no mark on the exterior. When the villagers forced the door open, They found only Madeline's candle burning on the mantel, and her body curled beneath it like a cat that had gone to sleep. Her face, they said, was peaceful, but her hands were scorched, aflame with a memory. Eleanor stepped toward the mantel again, despite the rising tension in the room. Each time she drew closer to the candle, the heat grew sharper, not like a fire, but like embarrassment, like being exposed. She lit this candle every night, Father Danvers murmured behind her. It was part of her ritual, even when she was little. The mantel was coated in wax rings, dried drips layered upon older ones, years and years of ritual melting into place. Father Danvers continued. She said it kept the voices away, said if the flame stayed lit, the things under the chapel couldn't come up. Eleanor's breath hitched. And if it goes out? He looked toward the chapel wall, behind which the old stone foundation held ancient soil. They come closer. The first whisper that night, Eleanor decided to keep watch alone. Father Danvers refused to remain, insisting he would pray from the sanctuary instead. She sat in a chair facing the candle. The room was silent, thick with expectation. The kind of silence that bends sound, so you hear your breath in your throat and your heartbeat in your teeth. Around midnight, the flame dimmed. Not because of wind, not because of a lack of air. It bowed, slightly as if acknowledging something that had entered. Then, from the corner of the room, Eleanor heard it, a whisper, not words, not yet, just the sound of fabric dragging across stone, of small things moving in the walls. She gripped her journal with white knuckles. The whisper continued, growing clearer. It wasn't coming from behind her or the walls. It came from beneath the floor. Directly under the candle. The hatch beneath the mantel. The next morning, Eleanor tore away the carpet beneath the mantel. There it was, an iron ring, rusted but intact, embedded in the wooden planks. A trapdoor. She paused. Part of her wanted to run, to leave the past buried, but the candle had burned all night. Not once did the flame waver after that whisper, like something was pleased it had been heard. Eleanor opened the hatch. A short stairwell descended into a stone chamber, no larger than a broom closet. The air was dry, bone dry, and in the center of the floor, surrounded by wax circles and tiny burnt matches, was a stone bowl. Inside the bowl, ash. And something else. Hair. Long, dark strands knotted with candle wick, Madeline's or someone else's. A voice like wax. Eleanor lit another candle. She placed it next to the bowl. The moment the wick caught, the whispering returned. Only now it had shape. Cold, it said. Cold in the cracks. Eleanor froze. Are you Madeline? She asked aloud. Silence. Then colon double quotes cracks. Not cracks in stone. Cracks in thought. The whisper wound around her like smoke. It wasn't coming from her ears. It was pressing into her mind. Fire keeps the thoughts whole. Don't let it. Stop. Eleanor staggered backward. This was not Madeline. Or at least not just Madeline. Father Danvers' warning. When Eleanor told him what happened, the priest grew quiet. I tried to do what you did once, he confessed. Years ago, I thought the candle was just superstition. I wanted to put it out, to let the house rest. But that night, I had the dream. Eleanor leaned forward. What dream? I was in the chapel, alone, but when I looked up at the altar, something was kneeling there. Skin like wax, face like melting soap. It turned and whispered, "Bring me the flame." He shook his head. I never slept in the house again. The last test that night, Eleanor sat by the candle once more, held a snuffer in one hand and her journal in the other. The room was cold. Her breath clouded. She snuffed the flame. The light vanished instantly, leaving a hollow blackness behind. At first, there was only silence, then the sound of footsteps. From within the walls, from the floor. From inside the mantel itself. The whisper returned, no longer gentle, but sharp, hissing, cold cold. No fire break the seal. The ash bowl below began to smoke. The floorboards groaned as something pressed upward from beneath. Eleanor's hands shook. She grabbed the matches and relit the candle. The moment the flame returned, the sound ceased. Stillness. The silence returned. Only now, it felt warm. And safe. The candle's purpose, it was never meant to be extinguished. Madeline knew it. Father Danvers had come to understand it, and now Eleanor saw it clearly. The candle was not just a ward. It was a memory of someone holding darkness back. Night after night, of a girl who lived with whispers, but never let them in. It was not about faith or fear. It was about persistence, about standing guard. Final entry in Eleanor's journal. Tonight I lit the candle again. And again the silence stayed. I don't know if I'm protecting them from it or it from them, but I will keep the flame alive as Madeline did, not out of fear, but out of love. Because sometimes the thing that guards us is not the brightest light, but the one that refuses to die. The wind that had once carried the faint tolling of the old church bell now seemed to swirl lower, heavier, and colder, as if it were dragging something buried with it. From the steps of St. Morwenna's chapel, Imogen stared at the cracked tombstone, where the final sound had emanated. Her lantern flickered, refusing to hold a steady flame, as though the air itself disapproved of light. And beside her, her Uncle Thomas whispered prayers that no longer felt like protection. The bell had not tolled since. Silence had returned, not the comforting hush of nightfall, but the bruised, tight-lipped silence of something holding its breath. Imogen stepped closer to the stone. Her fingers grazed the moss-ridden inscription, Benedict Ilwell, Keeper of the Bell -1764. A crack split the name as though time itself had tried to erase it. Why here? She asked aloud. Why him? Thomas remained behind, clutching the lantern tighter. The grave wasn't always here, he said after a pause. It used to be sealed within the chapel, buried beneath the bell itself. Imogen turned, her breath hitching. What do you mean? They moved him, he said, his eyes avoiding hers. After what happened in 1806, after the winter the bell wouldn't stop ringing. That year, legend had it that the villagers had heard the bell tolling every night at precisely midnight, even when the bell ropes had been cut and the tower sealed. It rang from within the stone, from the soil, from under the church floor itself. It wasn't until children began disappearing that someone dared to break the bell apart, and in the center of the shattered bronze, they had found it. Not a clapper, but a curled-up shape, a skeleton of a child. No name, no record, just bones and silence. They blamed Benedict Elwell, the bellkeeper who had vanished a generation earlier. Some claimed they had seen him walking the graveyard path at night, covered in soot and ash, pressing his finger to his lips. He was reburied outside the chapel walls. Silenced, they hoped. But silence had a way of growing roots. Imogen crouched beside the grave now, fingers trembling as she brushed away the leaf litter. She felt a vibration in the earth, not a tremor, but a rhythm. A slow, steady beat, like a distant drum heard through cloth, not a bell. A heartbeat. She leaned down, pressing her ear to the stone. Thump, thump, thump. Her breath stopped. Not her imagination, not the echo of her own body. This was beneath the grave. Under the earth, she stumbled back. Thomas stepped forward, eyes wide. You heard it? You knew? She asked. I heard it once, he admitted. Years ago, when I was about your age. I thought it was a dream. But then I saw it, the bell, swinging in the tower when no wind blew. I never came back after that. Imogen's eyes darted to the chapel door. It creaked slowly open on its own. No wind. No footsteps. Just the yawning blackness within, and that same steady thump. Thump. Something was calling her. Inside the chapel, the air had changed. It no longer smelled of incense or damp stone, but of something older, something burnt and buried. The pews were covered in sheets, pale and clinging like shrouds. At the end of the nave, the rope to the bell tower hung still, though frayed at the base. Above, no bell could be seen, only shadows where it had once hung. Imogen stepped inside, lantern forward as she crossed the nave. Her foot landed on a loose board. It shifted with a groan. She paused, crouched, and pried it open with a sharp tug. Beneath the floorboard, instead of stone foundation, there was a hollow, just wide enough for a person. A black cloth lay there, folded and tied, with a red ribbon. She reached in and lifted it out. Inside, a diary, leather-bound, worn. Benedict's journal they gave me the bell to care for. Said it had been forged with sacred hands. But that sound, that tone, it wasn't holy. It sang in dreams. It sang in grief. I saw her the first night, a girl in white, barefoot in the tower. Her mouth sewn shut, her eyes asking to be heard. The bell wanted something. I stopped ringing it after the frost took the children, but still it sang, from beneath. From inside me, I buried her bones in its hollow. Maybe that would silence it. But it only sang louder. They'll blame me, I know. But I only kept the watch. It was the bell that chose. Imogen dropped the book, her hands icy. Her uncle was at her side now, pale. We have to leave, he said. Now, but the door slammed shut behind them, and then came the sound. Not from above, from beneath, from the crypt, dong, one heavy toll. No bell to be seen, dong, the air tightened. The dust lifting as if gravity had been loosened, dong, the chapel groaned. The walls shifting slightly as though the building itself were waking up. Imogen turned, heart pounding. We have to go down. What? There's something beneath this chapel. It's not just a bell. It's alive. They made their way to the crypt entrance. The spiral stairs groaned underfoot as they descended, lantern light flickering against the stone walls. A smell rose to meet them, not of death, but of scorched metal and damp earth. At the base, a door long rusted shut stood before them. Imogen pressed her palm to it, and it opened without resistance. Inside, a cavern, carved and smooth, with bones embedded in the walls like decoration. And in the center, something massive, a bell. But this was no ordinary bell. It was larger than any that could have fit in the tower. Its surface was etched with names, hundreds, maybe thousands. Some in Latin, some in languages Imogen couldn't recognize. One name pulsed faintly with light. Imogen Alder. She stepped back. No, she whispered. That's not possible. The bell tolled again, and this time she saw her own face reflected in the bronze, but older, hollow-eyed, her mouth sewn shut. Thomas pulled her back. We're not supposed to be here. But why me? The bell's surface shimmered, and words formed. The keeper hears. The keeper tolls. The keeper becomes. Imogen understood now. The bell didn't ring out its own. It chose someone. Someone who could hear it. Someone who wouldn't look away. It had chosen her. Thomas grabbed the diary and held it up. There must be a way to stop it. They flipped through the final page. To silence the bell, bury its name. Not the bones, not the sound, but the one. It speaks through. Imogen looked at him, eyes wide. It wants to be forgotten. The names on the bell, they were the ones who had heard it. The ones who had become part of it. Imogen's name still pulsed. But the others were fading. I have to let go, she said softly. What do you mean? She turned to him, smiling with tears in her eyes. You have to forget me. No, it's the only way. She stepped toward the bell and with one final breath, whispered, Erase my name. The bell gave one last toll, long, low, and final. And then, silence. The kind of silence that settles over graves long forgotten. Weeks later, St. Morwenna's chapel was sealed. The villagers said it was unsafe, crumbling. Thomas left the village soon after. In his journal, he kept a single page blank, no name, no memory, just a feeling that something had once been there. A sound, a girl, a bell, but he could never quite remember why it mattered. And beneath the chapel, the bell slept. No name. Left to call it. No one left to hear it. Only silence, the truest keeper of all. There's a place in St. Arliths that the locals never point out to tourists. It's not marked on maps, not mentioned in brochures about this sleepy, mist-clung hamlet nestled in the Devon countryside. Ask around and you might get a vague answer or a polite shrug, but bring up the Tithe Barn too many times, and the conversation will stop altogether. The Tithe Barn still stands at the edge of the woods. The timbers lean just slightly, but they've resisted wind in time. The beams are blackened, not by fire, but by something older, something that has soaked into them from the inside. No one remembers when it was last used, but it's always been there, even before the village church was rebuilt, even before the river changed course, even before people stopped talking about what happened in 1743. Back then, St. Arliths was smaller than it is now. No more than a dozen stone cottages, one cobbler, one midwife, and a priest with fading eyesight. The Tithe Barn, as its name implies, was where villagers left 1/10 of their crops and earnings for the church. It stood alone on a rise near the edge of the trees, its sloped roof slick with moss, the doors iron-bound and ancient even then. Inside, it was cavernous and cold. A single window let in a shaft of pale light that never reached the far end. Straw rustled underfoot, even when no one walked. There was a smell to it, not entirely unpleasant, but earthy, heavy, and ever-present. In October 1743, just after the harvest moon, the changes began. It started small. Sheep refused to graze near the barn. Dogs barked at it when no one was inside. Cats would not go near its doors. Then came the wind that never reached the village proper, but circled the barn with insistent whispers, like a conversation just behind your back. Then came the voices, not voices you could understand. Not at first, just murmurs. A stream of half-heard phrases, too fast, too soft, too fragmented to make sense. But they came from within the barn, always from within. Even when it was locked. Old Thomas Linley, the church caretaker, was the first to speak openly. He'd been with the parish since youth and had grown hardened to creaks and shadows. But even he found unease in the barn. I heard my name, he told the vicar one morning, face pale beneath his soot-streaked hair. Not just any whisper, it were Ned's voice, my brother. Dead these 10 winters, the vicar tried to reassure him. Thomas was getting on in years, perhaps a dream. But then the vicar heard it too, not his name. Not even a voice he recognized, but something deep and guttural, rising from beneath the floorboards. It was not a cry, not laughter, something in between. 2 days later, they found Thomas in the church, just before matins. He lay curled before the altar, eyes wide open, mouth packed with dried wheat, hands clutching a wooden cross as though it could anchor him to life. The doctor could find no wounds, no sign of struggle. His heart had simply stopped. The villagers whispered about it for a few days, and then they stopped. Just as they always did. But the barn didn't stop. That winter, food spoiled more quickly. Root vegetables went black inside. Bread would not rise. Milk curdled even in the cold. The Tithe Barn's thatch was found soaked, through with moisture even after days of clear sky. Then came the second death. Mary Cudlow, a weaver's widow, had 2 sons. One evening she sent the elder, Jacob, to leave a sack of barley in the barn. He never came back. They found the sack just inside the threshold, still full, but no sign of the boy. 3 days later, his voice was heard coming from the barn. "Ma," it whispered. "Ma, I'm cold. Let me out." The village turned on itself. Some blamed Mary for tempting the devil with pride. Others blamed the vicar, who had ceased blessing the barn each Lammas since his arthritis worsened. The barn was padlocked. Boards were nailed across its doors. Salt was poured in a ring around the foundation. But the voices got louder. A month later, a girl was born with no eyes. The midwife said she came early, but the mother swore she felt the baby go still only the night before, the same night the barn's door was found ajar despite its iron padlock. More began to speak of strange dreams. Dreams of walking through straw in the dark, barefoot, unable to move faster than a crawl. Dreams of standing in the barn with someone behind them, breathing steadily, just above their shoulder. Then came the night of fire. 3 village men, drunk with fear and ale, lit torches and went to burn the barn down. Their plan was crude, simple. Fire to timber, prayer to God, and no more whispers. Only one man returned. He was never right afterward. He refused to speak, refused to sleep indoors. Spent his days carving wooden figures of people with no mouths. Hundreds of them. The other 2 men were never found, and the barn did not burn, not a single scorch mark. The torches dropped to the ground, half spent, still smoking. The salt line now blown into a spiral. After that, the village made a pact. The tithe barn was to be left alone. Not boarded, not blessed, just abandoned. Its name was removed from records. The priest stopped mentioning it. Children were warned away, not with stories, but with silence. And slowly, as generations passed, the memory of what happened in 1743 became little more than a void, a piece of collective forgetting. But the barn still stands. Every few decades, a new child hears something. A visitor wanders too far from the trail. A local swears they see movement between the cracks in the timber. But nothing more happens. Not until now. Not until the soil started to rot again. Not until someone began hearing the murmurs once more. The sun never shone the same way on Chedworth once the floorboards were torn up. After the carpenter's gruesome discovery, the vicar ordered the tithe barn sealed. The bones, those strangely contorted, half-charred remains, were quietly taken to the churchyard and buried in unconsecrated ground. No records were made, no name was spoken. The workers were told to forget what they saw. The barn was left to the ivy and wind, but something did not forget. Within a week, the miller's daughter, Eliza, began speaking in her sleep. Not mumbling, not dreaming, whispering. At first, her parents thought she was simply reciting church verses. But one night her mother pressed her ear to the wall and realized Eliza was whispering in a language no one recognized, harsh, clipped, rasping like parchment tearing. By morning, the grain in their sacks had molded. Not just spoiled, turned black as coal and stinking of iron. The chickens refused to eat it. Their youngest son, Thomas, poked a finger into the rot and burst into sobs that wouldn't stop for hours. More families began to report the same. Black grain, spoiled oats, flour crawling with weevils. And always a thin coat of dust-like flour, but finer, that covered shelves, clothing, even the skin. It clung to eyelashes. It dulled the sunbeams that passed through kitchen windows. The baker swore he heard voices from his flour bins. The schoolteacher broke down during lessons, claiming he saw tiny finger marks on the chalkboard each morning, though he wiped it clean every night. And the tithe barn? It was no longer still. Children walking past heard soft knocks coming from within, like someone dragging fingertips along the beams. One boy, James Harker, dared another to touch the old iron ring on the barn door. The moment his hand touched the metal, he went pale and fainted. He woke up 3 hours later with deep scratches across his palm, scratches that formed what looked like letters, but in a script no one could read. That night, his mother woke to find James sitting upright in bed, whispering, "They're still hungry. They were buried wrong." The next day, the vicar left town without a word. Elders in Chedworth started to avoid the church. Not from loss of faith, but because of what they noticed on their walks, white, powdery residue at the foot of the bell tower. Birds stopped perching on the steeple, and someone no one admitted who began carving crude symbols into trees and doors. Circles crossed with thorns, eyes with no pupils. It wasn't vandalism. It was fear. Inside homes, whispers began to rise with the flower dust. Entire families would pause at supper when they heard it, faint muttering, like someone speaking just beyond the edge of hearing. Sometimes it sounded like chanting, sometimes like crying, and sometimes, in the quiet before dawn, the whispers would shift into screaming, but only for a heartbeat, only enough to make you question whether it was real. The miller's wife awoke one night to find her husband standing in the barn, holding a torch dangerously close to the dry hay. He stared at the ceiling with wide, terrified eyes and said, "They want the dust to spread. It carries their mouths." She wrestled the torch from his hand. The next morning, he had no memory of it. A traveling peddler named Osric came through the village that autumn. He was old, sharp-eyed, and smelled faintly of smoke and salt. The villagers didn't speak to him much, but Eliza's father offered him a place to sleep in their grain shed. No one used it anymore, since the rot had spread. By dawn, the shed had burned to the ground. Osric survived. Barely. He was found wandering near the river, soaked to the bone, muttering the same thing again and again. The sun never shone the same way on Chedworth once the floorboards were torn up. After the carpenter's gruesome discovery, the vicar ordered the tithe barn sealed. The bones, those strangely contorted, half-charred remains, were quietly taken to the churchyard and buried in unconsecrated ground. No records were made, no name was spoken. The workers were told to forget what they saw. The barn was left to the ivy and wind, but something did not forget. Within a week, the miller's daughter, Eliza, began speaking in her sleep. Not by the time the first frost curled around the edges of the fields, something strange had already begun to grow within Chedworth's barns, something more insidious than rot, more silent than mold. It began, as such things often do, with breath. Shallow, ragged, and constant, Farmer Thorne was the first to fall ill. He had spent every day that autumn bent beneath the sloping beams of the tithe barn, sifting through the old sacks of grain that were turning to dust in their seams. He coughed. Once, then again. And then it never stopped. Day and night, in his cottage near the hedgerow, his lungs clawed for air as if something in the grain had reached in and gripped him by the chest. When he finally staggered through the village square, hollow-eyed and trembling, he tried to speak, but all that came out was a thin, high whistle. "The bones," he rasped. "They breathe." They buried him 2 days later. His death might have passed quietly, like so many before, had it not been for what came after. Children began to wake at night, hacking dry coughs that scraped their throats raw. Dogs refused to enter the barns, pacing nervously at the threshold before bolting. And always beneath it all was the whispering, not quite wind, not quite voice, just enough to make the hairs on the back of the neck rise as villagers passed by the old stone walls of the tithe barn. Old Mrs. Denham, who lived closest to the barn, swore she heard someone sobbing within the rafters every night after sunset. "It's not mourning," she told the vicar, "it's warning." And then came the dreams. People who had never stepped foot in the barn claimed they saw it in their sleep. Long, crooked beams splitting open like ribs. Shadowy figures crawling beneath the floorboards. Piles of ancient bones heaving with breath. The nightmares always ended the same way: someone turned around to face the whispering, and their mouth opened in a scream. But no sound came out. Villagers grew desperate. No illness could be found. No fever, no lesions. Only coughing, persistent, rattling, like dust had taken root in their lungs. The doctor from Northleach arrived and found nothing, no plague, no known affliction. "It's the cold," he said, "or perhaps a shared madness. Burn the grain if you must." They did. But even as the last of the dusty sacks turned to ash, the coughing remained. Then, one night, a low rumble echoed across the fields. The tithe barn door, centuries old and sealed tight with rusted iron, had swung open on its own. 3 men volunteered to go in: the blacksmith, the miller, and the vicar. The village held its breath. They were gone an hour. Only the vicar returned. He didn't speak for days. When he did, it was in a whisper that never rose above a breath. "The floorboards," he said. "They breathe." "What do you mean?" Someone asked. He shook his head slowly. "They were never meant to be disturbed." From that night forward, no one dared approach the barn again. Children were forbidden to play nearby. Animals would not graze within 50 paces of it. The wind whistled differently, near its walls more shrill, like it remembered lungs that no longer breathed. And through it all, the coughing continued. Not everyone fell ill, but enough did that Chedworth began to feel hollow, like something was scooping it out from the inside. Then, as suddenly as it began, the coughing stopped. No one celebrated. They just waited, and in that silence, something shifted beneath the tithe barn. The stone seemed heavier. The grain that grew nearby came out twisted, as if something unseen had gnawed at its roots. And in the coldest hours of the night, the villagers swore they could hear it, the dry rasp of breath just beneath their feet. Waiting, watching, remembering. The spring of 1839 arrived with a deceptive softness in Chedworth. Lambs tottered in meadows, daffodils broke through thawed soil, and birdsong returned like a hymn no one had dared to sing all winter. Yet under the vicarage, beneath the very feet of Reverend William Alderton, something refused to thaw. Though the barn had been sealed, its loft dusted with lime, and its lower doors bolted, the air remained tense with a silence that dared not be broken. Every so often, a parishioner would glance toward the barn mid-sermon, their gaze lingering just long enough to be noticed, then quickly dropped, as though their thoughts were sinful. It was Reverend Alderton who felt the full weight of the past bearing down on his roof and floorboards. His house was old, stone-laid, and timber-bird, and stood just a dozen paces from the tithe barn. Every time he sat at his desk to prepare a sermon or kneeled to pray, he heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping like knuckles on hollow wood beneath the floor. At first, he dismissed it. Rats, perhaps. Or the creaks of a home settling after a long frozen winter. But it returned night after night, always at the same hour, just before midnight, when the wind dipped low and the village held its breath. He grew uneasy in his own home. The sounds grew louder, not just tapping, but dragging, coughing, as though some hidden thing wheezed beneath his very bed. One night, Alderton took up his oil lamp and descended to the cellar. The room smelled of mildew and coal dust. Barrels lined the corners, and an old servant's bell hung near the door long unused. The air was unnaturally cold. He pressed his palm to the flagstone floor and felt a tremor, slight but unmistakable, running through the stone. Then the bell rang. Once, sharp, loud, as if yanked from the other side of death. He fled that night and slept in the church. The following morning, Reverend Alderton did something no vicar of Chedworth had done in 2 centuries. He began to dig. With a crowbar and shovel, he pried up the stone tiles beneath his study. The villagers gathered quietly outside his windows, watching as he labored with sweat and fear. Inch by inch, dirt gave way to splintered wood. A trapdoor. He hadn't known it was there. No one had. He opened it, revealing a shallow chamber barely the size of a coffin, lined with old timbers and thick cobwebs. And in it, bones. Dozens of them. Some were human, others larger. Misshapen, not quite animal, not quite man. Their edges were jagged, as though they'd been chewed or grown that way. And beside them lay a child's toy, a straw doll, mouth sewn shut. Alderton did not scream. He simply lowered the trapdoor, covered it again with soil and stone, and nailed. Shut his study with holy oil. From that day on, he no longer walked near the barn. His sermons took on a tremble. He spoke of original sin and the weight of memory. And every night, from beneath his floor, the coughing began a new hoarse, ragged, endless. The village never questioned him. The barn remained closed. And the trapdoor was never opened again. The air had thickened by the end of October. Not with smoke or soot, though the hearth still burned, but with the dry, almost metallic taste of old sickness and quiet guilt. The villagers of Old Marlow no longer entered the chapel of St. Bethel. Its doors stood ajar, yet no one dared step inside. Not since the vicar stopped speaking. That had happened on a cold Sunday, under a sky that bruised purple long before sunset. Vicar Aldwych arrived, pale and slow-footed, to perform evening prayers. But when he opened his mouth, nothing came out. His lips moved, his throat twitched, but no voice emerged, only a faint choking sound, a dry rasp. Then silence. He tried. Again. Then again. Nothing. The congregation froze. Then he turned his back and quietly walked out through the vestr. Why? No one saw him again. Not properly. Inside the chapel, the air now seemed heavier than the stones it was built with. Dust hung like breath. Pews once scrubbed clean were gray with fine powder. The altar cloth had browned at its edges, and the once red carpet leading to the pulpit had turned the color of rotting cherries. But what most disturbed the villagers wasn't what they saw. It was what they heard, or thought they did. Late at night, some claimed they heard murmurs rising from the chapel floorboards. Faint prayers, soft as wind and twisted in tone, never loud, never clear. Always wrong. Words meant for comfort that left listeners shivering. One widow, Maura Littlecroft, swore she heard her husband's voice reciting the Lord's Prayer. He had died 2 winters ago, wheezing in his sleep. They never buried him proper, she told her neighbor. No bell, no blessing, no final words, just a hole. That chapel holds what should have been spoken aloud. Others began avoiding the chapel road altogether. Even passing it at night became an ordeal. Farmers told of oxen refusing to walk past. Children whimpered if they so much as glanced toward the belfry. And then there was Gareth, the miller's boy. Gareth was simple in speech, but sharp of memory. He remembered the vicar's words before the silence, the last proper sermon. Something about how, when a prayer dies on the tongue, it sinks into the walls. Gareth, being young and unafraid, believed that the vicar had simply buried something. Too deep to speak. So one evening, he went in, just past twilight. While his father was grinding the last sacks for the harvest fair, he brought with him a single lantern and his mother's silver rosary, which he wore wrapped around his wrist like a charm. He stepped into the chapel and found it still and cold, colder than outside, like the walls had drawn all the warmth inward and sealed it shut. The pews whispered, not aloud but in the way old wood settles, the way echoes feel after the noise. Is gone. Gareth tiptoed toward the pulpit. The altar seemed taller than he remembered, its edges lost in shadow. The heavy iron bell rope dangled, unmoved, thick with old mildew. And then a cough. Sharp, wet, right behind him. Gareth spun, lifting the lantern. No one. But he heard it again, this time from the floor, as if the stone itself were clearing its throat. Then came something worse. A voice, not like a man's, nor a woman's, but somewhere in between. Dry, whispering, almost pleading. Finish what was never finished. It came from beneath the altar. Gareth stepped forward, heart pounding. He lowered the lantern to the stone flooring. And saw it. A crack. Small, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. A narrow seam ran the width of the altar base, neatly carved, too even to be age or erosion. Gareth reached out. The moment his fingers brushed the stone, the air turned warm, thick, like hot breath on his neck. Another whisper followed. Words buried, but not forgotten. He didn't scream. Gareth was a brave boy, but he did run. That night, the grain stores soured. All of them. Even the sealed bins. By morning, the villagers discovered rot in the wheat. Black mold where it hadn't been the day before. Something foul had bloomed overnight, from no visible source. And the chapel doors? Shut tight, not locked, just sealed, like the building itself had decided to close its mouth. That Sunday, no. Prayers were spoken. No hymns rose. The bells stayed silent. In the days that followed, something odd took hold of the village. It began with the vicar's old cat. The creature had always been aloof, fond of hiding under the pews. But now it stood outside the chapel each morning, staring at the doors. It refused food. It meowed without sound, just like the vicar had. Then came the dreams. Multiple villagers reported them. Dreams of standing in the pulpit and trying to speak, only to find their tongues turn to grain or wax. They'd wake choking, gasping for breath. One farmer's wife began to bleed from the mouth in her sleep. She whispered a name before slipping into a coma, Aldwych. A meeting was called, held in the old tavern cellar, away from the ears of the walls. Some believed they needed to burn. The chapel, it's cursed, they said. It's holding something that no longer belongs in this world. Others warned against it. If it's sealed now, let it stay sealed. But an elder Edith Ferndale, the oldest in the village, spoke softly from her stool. There was a vicar once 3 generations back, she said. Tried to silence a plague by refusing to ring the bell. Thought if he didn't toll it, death wouldn't come, so the prayers were never spoken. The dead were buried in hush. She paused. But prayers unspoken don't vanish. They gather, like fog, and someday they rise. The villagers did not act that night, but the fog did. Rise. The next morning, mist lay thick across the chapel grounds, but only there. The rest of the village stood clear in bright sun, and the fog did not move. It clung to the stones, dense and unmoving. Inside it, the bells began to toll. 1, 2, 3. Though no hand pulled the rope. And beneath the sound, if you stood close enough, you might have heard it. A prayer, half finished, stuck in a voice that could not speak. Even after the last body was buried, and the soot-black smoke stopped rising from Wittershall's crumbling chimneys, the village was never truly quiet. There was a stillness, yes, a hush thick as fog, but not the kind that comes with peace. It was a silence of things left unsaid, of things not yet finished, of things not yet dead. The grain mill never reopened. Despite efforts from distant relatives of the Mathers family and investors from nearby towns, the machinery refused to start. Workers reported cold drafts brushing against their necks, even on windless days. Tools vanished. Pigeons wouldn't nest in the rafters. And worst of all, every time someone set foot inside to work the grain, they heard a cough, dry and rattling coming from somewhere deep in the machinery. It would begin faintly, echoing like wind in an old chimney. But then it grew louder, closer, wetter. No one stayed past sunset. At the church, Father Cedric's replacement, a gentle young man named Edwin Crane, tried to bring warmth back to the broken village. He organized sermons, relit the oil lamps, and rang the bells again. But strange things kept happening. The church pews, once filled with worshipers, now creaked on their own, as if unseen bodies still sat in reverence. The church mice disappeared. Cats wouldn't go near the altar. And then, Edwin began coughing. First, only in the mornings, then during service, then through the night. By winter, he locked himself in the vicarage with a crucifix in each hand and refused to speak. Villagers say he whispered constantly prayers, apologies, and sometimes just a single word: whistle. He vanished during a snowstorm. His boots were found neatly placed outside the church door, but no tracks led away. The bell rope was swinging. By the turn of the century, only 6 families remained in Wittershall. Crops wouldn't grow. Livestock would flee into the woods. Letters posted to the town were returned unopened, the ink smeared as though wept upon. Folklorists began to visit paranormal investigators. One by one, they left. Most refused to talk about what they saw. One left behind a notebook. Inside, under a childlike sketch of a man made entirely of wheat husks, were the words, "He comes with harvest. Always has." The last living child of Whittershall, a girl named Eliza Fenwick, spoke to a BBC radio team in the 1950s. She'd long since moved to Norwich, but agreed to an interview about her childhood. She was 5 when her brother disappeared in the granary. "It was warm," she said, voice trembling. "Too warm. Like something breathing." She never returned to the village. The next year, her interviewer died from a sudden infection of the lungs. His last words were recorded. "He's still whispering. He's in the wheat." Today, Whittershall appears on no map. The roads have crumbled. Locals in nearby towns refuse to give directions, but sometimes hikers who stray too far report stumbling upon a quiet hamlet. The houses lean with age. The fields stretch wide and golden, but oddly untouched. No tractor marks, no broken stalks. And deep in the village square, half buried in weeds, sits the old church bell. It never rings, not by hand, but if you listen closely, if the wind is just right, you'll hear something else. A whistle, a cough, a rasping voice that says, "Harvest never ends." And in that moment, the silence of Whittershall speaks louder than any scream. The grain dust never settles, because silence never left. It simply waits. The village of Elmbrook had no need for clocks. Each morning, just before dawn, a faint, reedy tune would drift from the hills, soft and slow like a lullaby unraveling backward. No one ever saw the piper. The music always came from the same place, Windle's Hollow, a shallow dip in the earth surrounded by bramble and ash trees, a mile from the nearest house. The piper had been playing since before the oldest living villager was born. Children grew up knowing the tune. Shepherds hummed it in their sleep. Birds, oddly enough, never sang during those twilight minutes. The sound of the pipe filled the valley with such quiet magic that even the dogs didn't bark. It wasn't cheerful, but it wasn't mournful either. It simply existed like mist or morning. The village of Elmbrook had no need for clocks. Each morning, just before dawn, a faint, reedy tune would drift from the hills, soft and slow like a lullaby unraveling backward. No one ever saw the piper. The music always came from the same place, Windle's Hollow, a shallow dip in the earth surrounded by bramble and ash trees, a mile from the nearest house. The piper had been playing since before the oldest living villager was born. Children grew up knowing the tune. Shepherds hummed it in their sleep. Birds, oddly enough, never sang during those twilight minutes. The sound of the pipe filled the valley with such quiet magic that even the dogs didn't bark. It wasn't cheerful, but it wasn't mournful either. It simply existed like mist or morning dew. People had theories, of course. Some said it was just the wind in the stones. Others claimed it was an old shepherd playing before sunrise, a tradition passed down for generations. But the shepherds never claimed it. In fact, none would go near Windle's Hollow in the dark. The tune had always been there, always. Until one morning. It wasn't. That day, everything felt wrong. The sky looked paler than usual. Chickens refused to leave their coops. Mr. Fenwick, the baker, burned 3 loaves in a row because he'd gotten up late, unaware that dawn had come and gone. Didn't hear the piper, he muttered to his wife. Slept through the light. You always sleep through the light, she snapped, but her voice trembled slightly. By afternoon, the entire village was buzzing, not with activity, but confusion. It felt like a pause had come over life itself, as though the air held its breath. At dusk, a group of boys dared each other to go to Windle's Hollow and look for the piper. None returned. Not that night. Not the next day. Not ever. The next morning, the music returned, but it wasn't the same. This time it sounded slower, hungrier, as if the melody had been softened by mud. There were cracks in the notes, like someone blowing through a pipe carved from bone rather than wood, and something else was different. The tune didn't stop at dawn. It kept playing through breakfast, through noon. All day, the same haunted melody threaded the air like a thread pulled through cloth. By sunset, the people of Elmbrook stayed inside. Even the elderly, who'd once sat on porches listening to the old tune with misty eyes, now locked their shutters tight. By nightfall, the music changed again. It became louder and closer. That night, Tom Fletcher stood in the dark behind his cottage. A retired schoolteacher with no family, he'd always found comfort in the piper's music. He'd even written a short poem about it once, tucked in a drawer somewhere, rhyming hollow with swallow in a way that made him blush. But this was not the same. He watched the road beyond his garden fence, moonlight spilling across the dirt path like spilled milk. The pipe's notes drifted from the shadows just past the bend. He couldn't see anyone, yet he knew with the certainty that comes from goosebumps and old bone memory that someone was there. Then, the music stopped. A breathless silence fell. Tom turned to go back inside. That's when he heard the whisper, just behind his left ear. "I liked you best." He didn't scream. Not at first. That came later, when his neighbors found him the next morning, standing barefoot in the frost, eyes wide, lips blue. Mute. Completely unable to speak again. By the fond why. Third day, 5 more people had vanished, and the tune never stopped playing. It simply moved. Some mornings it rose from the hollow. By evening, it echoed near the church. By midnight, it hovered around the old schoolhouse like smoke. You couldn't track it, but it always knew where you were. The village council, which hadn't convened in nearly 6 years, unless you counted the debate over replacing the church bell. Rope held an emergency meeting. Only 9 people showed up. Half of them left before the end. "What are we meant to do?" muttered Mrs. Grafton, clutching her rosary. "We can't fight a tune. It's just a man with a pipe," someone sighed. "No," whispered Reverend Priest, whose face had turned gray. "Not a man, never was." They asked him what he meant. He wouldn't say. Just crossed himself over and over again, murmuring a hymn. The cottage school at the edge of Wickering Hollow had been abandoned long before the war ever reached the village. Its stone chimney sagged, its windows shattered by storms or stones, no one quite remembered which. Moss climbed the walls like time itself had been trying to smother it into forgetting. But inside, the children's names were still faintly etched into the wooden desks with stubby nails and broken chalk. A doll's glass eye stared from beneath a floorboard. In that school, secrets had stayed buried, but not all of them quietly. Mrs. Larchmont, the old widow who had once taught there, had been gone 20 years. She'd gone missing during a thunderstorm, last seen holding a lantern on the hill as if trying to signal someone across the moor. The next day, only her iron ring of keys was found, hung on the school door. "Still warm," said the constable. People whispered that Mrs. Larchmont hadn't been alone in the school during her last days, that the school still echoed with childish voices, giggles at night, bare feet pattering on the stone floors long after everyone in the hollow had gone to bed. But the truth ran deeper and darker. It started with the cellar, hidden beneath a trapdoor covered by a moth-eaten rug. The cellar of the school was never on the official blueprints. Not even the post-war surveyors knew about it. But the children did. They used to go down there when it rained, whispered Meg Slattery, now an old woman herself, her voice rattling like an empty teacup. "We weren't meant to, but Mrs. Larchmont never stopped us." The cellar was lined with thick bricks and sloped strangely, as if it had been carved into the ground not by human hands, but by something that wanted to nest, to curl, to grow colder over time. There were drawings on the walls, Meg had said, eyes distant. Childish, but not ours. Too old. Too wrong. And in that cellar, the children of Wickering Hollow had hidden Not from bombs or soldiers, but from the man with no hat. The man with no hat arrive only when the village clock skipped. That's how they knew he was coming. The clock in the tower would stutter, jump backwards 2 seconds, then chime the hour twice. They said he wore a long coat soaked from rain, even on dry days, and carried a small silver bell that didn't ring. But he had no hat. No one knew why that mattered. Only that the children whispered it to each other like a spell. If you see the man and he's wearing no hat, run. They'd bolt for the cellar, slam the trapdoor, and recite their names backward until they forgot how to spell. And then wait. Sometimes they'd wait for minutes, sometimes hours. One child, Emily Marsh, waited 2 whole days before emerging. Her hair gone white and a line of ink scrawled across her neck. She never spoke again. Her chalk drawings after that were only of the bell, the bell, the bell, the bell, the disappearance. 6 children vanished the winter before the school closed. All within the same week. No signs of struggle, just empty beds. Shoes placed neatly at the foot. A cracked pane open just enough for wind to whistle, and Mrs. Larchmont had grown strange after that. She stopped writing on the chalkboard, stopped speaking altogether. She simply stood by the classroom window each afternoon, looking out toward the marsh where the fog sat, too thick for comfort. Some said she was waiting for something. Some said she was making sure something stayed away. Either way, she was the last one to lock the school doors, and the first to vanish. And now visitors who come near the schoolhouse today report a strange feeling, as though they're being watched from beneath the earth. One woman, a traveling artist, claimed she heard the sound of children laughing beneath her feet. She ran, tripped, broke her leg, and was found the next morning with chalk drawings on her skin. The school remains closed, even to ghosts, but the wind still carries the bell's silence. And sometimes, just sometimes, the clock in Wickering Hollow skips backward, twice, and a coat, wet with no rain, can be seen just beyond the trees, waiting, for the ones who still remember how to run. For the ones who know the cellar's name, for those who don't wear hats. The clock tower of Eldergrove had always stood silently above the schoolhouse, a gray sentinel watching over the winding paths of the village. But in 1883, it began to skip. Not in the mechanical way one might expect, with rusted gears or snapped springs, but in time itself. It started subtly. At first, the school bell rang 3 minutes too early, then 5 minutes too late. Teachers blamed the groundskeeper, old Mr. Tulliver, who tended the tower. But Mr. Tulliver insisted he wound the clock with the same care he always had. He had even polished the brass pendulum until he could see his wrinkled reflection tremble in it. "It's the time that's wrong," he muttered once, "not the clock." By midwinter, the children began to speak of skipped minutes. They would blink, and the schoolroom would shift. One girl, Mary Ann Silvers, swore she had missed an entire spelling test. I was writing the word weather, and then the bell rang. It was suddenly time to go home. Miss Cartwright, the headmistress, scolded her for daydreaming. But then it happened to her, too. She was in the middle of reading aloud from a history book when she suddenly found herself standing at the window, coat on, darkness fallen. The book was still in her hand, but the chapter had already been finished, and no one remembered reading it. Children began to forget entire chunks of their day. Their slates bore answers they didn't recall writing. Some would be mid-word, and then they'd find the word finished. "It's like someone else is doing things for me," one boy whispered, terrified. "And I don't remember it." The missing minute soon. It was not just the school. Mrs. Langdon, who ran the bakery, began to notice that her loaves were undercooked, though she had set the timer. When she sat to knit, Rose would appear without her having moved the needles. Mr. Percy at the mill said his machinery would stop for 5 minutes every morning, and when it resumed, the flour level had risen as though someone unseen had continued the work. All throughout Eldergrove, time was thinning, slipping, as though the village was not living linearly anymore. but skipping like a scratched phonograph record. The only constant was the clock tower, still ticking, still chiming, but each day, its pendulum began to swing more erratically. And something else happened. Its face started to darken from within. Behind the glass, shadow swirled. Some villagers said it looked like smoke. Others whispered it was not smoke at all. In the third week of January, the children refused to enter the classroom. They live inside the clock, little Effie Langdon said, face pale, fingers trembling. The skippers, they take the bits we forget. They eat the moments we don't notice. And when asked who had told her such a thing, she simply replied, "The boy in the wall." Miss Cartwright nearly fainted. The boy in the wall. That same day, a carpenter was called in to investigate a peculiar noise coming from the base of the tower, a hollow tapping behind the chalkboard. He pried the wood away and uncovered a hidden space, narrow, dark, lined with old stone and dust. Wedged deep within was a narrow crawlway. Inside, they found a school satchel, faded and torn. Carved on the inside of the wall were dozens of tallies, counted days. No one could say whose bag it was. No child was missing. No one had reported anything, but some of the older residents remembered something chilling. "Back in '69, murmured one. "A boy was lost. Fell into the clock tower, never found. The gears were too dangerous to search." His name had been Timothy Giles. He had vanished after detention, and his name was eventually scrubbed from the rolls. They never told the newer teachers. They didn't want to frighten the children. Now, Timothy's bag had returned, somehow carried out of a forgotten moment. A skipped second, placed behind a wall that had no reason to be hollow. Miss Cartwright began to lose her grip on the days. One morning, she walked into the village square barefoot, asking if it was still Tuesday, even though it was Friday. Her shawl was inside out, her hands smeared with chalk and ink. The clock rang 13 times that night. The skipped people, villagers, began reporting seeing other versions of themselves, just for an instant, moving in mirrors or passing behind fogged window panes. One farmer said he waved to his own reflection in the barn's rain barrel, only to have the reflection walk away in the wrong direction. Old Mr. Tulliver was found sleeping beneath the pendulum one dawn, muttering, "They're stealing the seconds, taking them from the end of our lives and chewing them into now." He was dismissed from his post, and the tower was locked. That night, it rang 16 times. Inside their homes, clocks began to spin. Children wept in their sleep. Teachers complained of memories they didn't recognize, a birthday party they never had, a winter that hadn't come yet. Time was no longer just slipping, it was unraveling. And still, the clock stood, tall and unbending. Until one night, it finally stopped. The clock's heart. A group of villagers broke into the tower. What they found chilled them to the bone. The gears were gone, not broken, not rusted. Gone. In their place was something else entirely, a large, pulsing space like a hollow lung, wrapped in old black cloth, tied with school ties and bits of chalkboard frame. Around it, hundreds of pocket watches spun wildly, suspended in air, ticking out of rhythm. Floating at the center, gently, quietly, was Timothy Giles's school cap. No one dared touch it. No one spoke. They sealed the tower again, bricking it up. This time, and the school moved to a different building, far from the tower. Still, every few years, a child will stop mid-sentence and say, "Didn't we already do this?" Or look out the window, see something twitching in the shadows, and mutter, "He's still ticking." They say if you stand outside the sealed tower at 3:03 a.m., you'll hear the bell toll 13 times again, even though there's no bell left inside. And if you stay too long, you might miss a minute, or become one. Of the skipped. The days no longer flowed. In Wakesmere, they staggered. Not even the birds sang on time. When the church clock's hands reversed that midsummer evening, the children stopped playing mid-laugh. Mrs. Amble carrying a basket of eggs, paused and looked up, the color draining from her cheeks. A cow lowed in confused agony in the distance, and the air thickened like syrup, as though the village were being slowly pulled into a different rhythm when it had long ago tried to forget Dot at the manor house. Alden Brixley sat alone, the once proud heir of a family that had run Wakesmere's land and secrets for generations. He had heard the whispers as a child about the tolling bell that counted wrong, the boy who vanished during a leap year, the dog that aged backward before dying in its sleep. The clock, they said, was never right, but no one ever dared touch it. Until Alden had. He had meant well, meant to correct it, to fix the legacy of strange, twitching time he had inherited. But now the pendulum swung wildly inside the bell tower, faster, then slower, then not at all. And from the cracked tiles beneath the clock's casing, a soft, persistent tapping had begun, as though something long buried beneath stone and secrecy now found it easier to reach up and knock. The cracks beneath. Alden visited the church tower one last time, his breath fogged unnaturally in the warm July air as he climbed. The stone spiral felt longer than usual, the turnings uneven. When he reached the top, the chamber smelled like burnt feathers and wet dust. And there, sprawled in the middle of the clock room, was Father Entwistle, face down, still breathing, but his hands were raw, the fingernails chipped, as though he had tried to dig through the stone. A faint whisper hovered over him, like the murmur of children trying to count. 91, 92, 93. Alden knelt beside him, but Father Entwistle did not stir. The priest's breath hitched with every number, as though the ticking clock were inside him. It had gone too far. Alden looked up at the ancient mechanism. The gears now turned in shapes that made no mechanical sense. One looped, then folded. One trembled in place like it feared the next second. He did not understand it, but someone in Wakesmere once had. The diary, hidden in the manor's attic. Behind a wall panel Alden had never dared touch, was a blackened book. He found it not by searching, but by waking up from a dream in which his grandmother, eyes entirely black, whispered, "Turn the panel. The hour will come again." The book was bound in worn lambskin, the kind used to chronicle curses more than prayers. Its entries began in 1731 and ran until 1786. All were written by the village's original horologist, the one who had constructed the clock that now ruled Wakesmere. It keeps time for what lives beneath. Every child that disappears realigns the minutes. The bell does not toll, it listens. And when it rings 13, no one will leave Wakesmere again. There it was, page after page. Names he recognized from the village gravestones: Runnels, Parlow, Wick. Each had been a keeper of the gear, a guardian assigned to keep the clock's secret rotation intact, until one day they stopped writing, and the bell didn't. 13. On the 29th of July, the bell rang, not 12 chimes. 13. No one moved. At that moment, every clock in the village stopped, no matter its make, wind, or battery. Watches cracked, phone screens turned black. Even shadows refused to stretch forward. Time had arrived, not passed, not flowed. Arrived. Alden stood at the village square, surrounded by the townspeople. Old Miss Rennie wept softly into her apron. Mr. Jarlow held his infant as if unsure whether to cover her ears or run. Then came the sound. Tick. Not from the church, but from beneath. The earth pulsed once, like a slow heartbeat beneath cobblestones. Tick. The tower's base cracked. Something inside wanted out. Tick. The children in the crowd all turned to face the manor. All of them, at once. Even the ones too young to walk. What the children saw. It was them who moved first. The children, not adults. The small ones stepped away from their parents and began walking, not running, toward the tower. No one could stop them. They whispered, "We have to count. We have to finish the tick. It's our turn." Alden blocked the door, shouting, "You don't have to go in." but they passed around him, as though he were no more solid than the mist dot inside the tower. The mechanism had fully unwound. Gears hung like broken teeth from the ceiling. The pendulum swung without anchor. The faces of all 4 clocks turned blank dot, and on the floor, the children lay down. Side by side, a new bell began to form. Out of their breath. Out of the sound their lungs made when exhaling together. A hum, a tone, the final chime. The final tick. Alden did what no one had dared in 300 years. He shattered the face of the tower clock with the hammer from the bell room. Glass rained down, metal shrieked dot, and then time lurched out. The bell stuttered, the hum broke. Children gasped and sat up, dazed. A wind howled not from above, but from beneath the stone, followed by a deep moan. Like something had missed its meal. Dot. It was gone. The moment passed. Alden collapsed. He dreamed of his grandmother again. This time she was not whispering, but humming, a lullaby, off-key, as though to keep a child awake, not to sleep. Epilogue: the village that feared the hour. Wakesmere buried its old tower 3 days later. It was structurally unsound, they told outsiders, but no one speaks of what happened during those missing 30 minutes. And to this day, every child born in Wakesmere has a curious tick in their breath when they sleep. As if part of the clock lives on, just beneath the lungs, and the wind, every so often, still counts softly beneath the floorboards. Tick, tick, tick. The attic of the Hollow orphanage had been locked for decades, its door nailed shut, its key discarded long ago. Dust coated every inch of its wooden frame. It was not forgotten, it was avoided. Every child in the orphanage knew better than to ask about the attic. Every caretaker who came and went was warned never to open it. And every mirror in the house, every last one, was kept covered after sunset. It wasn't superstition. It was survival. But time dulls memory, and curiosity sharpens when fear fades. So when little Mara, a sharp-eyed, sharp-eared girl of 9, found herself staring at a tiny, uncovered hand mirror behind the linen closet, she did what children do when left alone with a mystery. She looked into it. At first, it showed her reflection, a pale face, crooked braid, the freckled nose she hated. Then something else, a flicker. The shape behind her, a girl, the same age, with the same face, but the eyes. The girl in the mirror didn't blink when Mara did. Didn't smile when she tried to. And her eyes were empty, like black buttons sewn into skin. Mara dropped the mirror and ran, but that wasn't the end. That was the opening. That night, Mara heard the whisper. It didn't come from the hallway, or the vents, or the wind outside. It came from behind the walls, from inside the mirror. She told her friend Tilly, who told Jacob, who dared them both to go back. The 3 of them crept into the linen closet with a flashlight and that same mirror, now cracked at the corner. They stared into it. And this time, the girl in the reflection smiled, but none of them did. The girl reached forward. From inside the mirror. Mara dropped it again, but this time the glass didn't break. It rippled like water. And something stepped through. For weeks after that night, Mara didn't sleep. Her eyes grew heavy. Her skin paled. Her voice cracked. She said the girl from the mirror was in the house now. Watching. Learning. Replacing. Tilly disappeared one morning after breakfast. Her bed was made, but her shoes were still under it. Jacob tried to joke about it, but when he looked in the bathroom mirror later that day, he screamed because Tilly was in it, smiling, and so was he. The version of him in the mirror stayed smiling. Long after he had stopped. By evening, he was gone too. The caretaker at the time, a weary woman named Mrs. Grant, tried to dismiss the children's fear. "You're just imagining things," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Old buildings do strange things." But that night, the mirrors began to uncover themselves, one by one. In the dining hall, in the hallway, in the nursery, all at once. Every sheet, every cloth, every newspaper once used to cover a mirror had fallen. Some children refused to open their eyes, covering their faces, turning toward the wall. Others whispered stories about the girl in the mirror, how she had no name, how she could not leave until she had found someone to become. By the end of the week, 5 children had vanished. And Mara was no longer Mara. She stopped blinking. She stopped speaking. She stood in front of mirrors for hours. When asked what she was doing, she only said, listening. One day, she wandered into the attic. No one saw her go. No one followed. But from that moment, the attic door, which had been nailed shut for years, stood slightly ajar. Cold air crept down the stairs, and in every mirror in Hollowind, a pale child stood just at the edge of reflection, never facing forward, always just turning around. Years passed. The orphanage closed. The building was left to rot. Boards covered the windows. Nature reclaimed the walls, but the attic remained, and the mirrors. They still stand, covered now, under tarps and old curtains, but not empty. Not silent. Whispers remain. And in every reflection, a little girl waits, not for help, but for a way out. The village of Willowmere stood at the edge of a slow, sweeping moor that dipped into a gray horizon. In the daylight, it was peaceful rows of stone cottages, hedgerows trimmed neat, and the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer in the distance. But at dusk, the winds changed, and at the very edge where the heather grew wild and the moorland turned to marsh, there was a sound, not quite a voice, not quite a song, but something between the two, an echo that didn't belong to anything that had ever spoken. The Edge House, the house had stood there long before the village. It had no path, no visible entrance, and no memory of ever being built. The elders of Willowmere didn't talk about it much, not because they were hiding something, but because when they did, strange things happened. Children went missing. Clocks slowed. Chimneys puffed out black feathers instead of smoke. One girl had gone there once. Her name was Mabel, and she was always curious. She was 10 years old and drawn to things that rustled without wind and knocked without hands. When she crossed the moor alone one evening to find the source of the echo, her footprints never returned. All that remained was the scarf her grandmother had knitted, wound tightly around the GATEPOSC. Since then, no child went near. And the echo still sang. Unfinished clocks. Edward Timms had a peculiar habit. He repaired clocks that nobody wanted. His workshop was filled with cracked faces, bent hands, and pendulums that no longer swung. Yet he insisted always that they still kept the old time. A time before schedules, before trains and wages and postmen. A deeper time. One evening, as Edward worked in his flickering candlelit shed, he heard the echo. It seeped in from under the door, curling around his ankles like mist. The sound came not in notes or tones, but in moments. He looked up. All 17 of his clocks had stopped at the same second. 4:17. He stared. The pendulums hung stiff. The tick-tick was gone, replaced by the hollow breath of the echo outside. Edward, who had never been afraid of sound or silence, suddenly found himself frozen. Then, one of the clocks struck once. A soft ding, but the hand hadn't moved. He whispered to himself. That was Mabel's clock. The return of the children on a bitter October morning. 3 children appeared in the village square, barefoot, dirt-smudged, eyes gray as ash. The villagers rushed to them, horrified, then confused. These weren't new children. They were the missing ones. Mabel, Tomlin, Sarah, the ones lost years ago, now returned without a day aged. When asked where they had been, they all answered the same: listening. To what? The house that whispers. Who whispered? Everyone. They spoke of staircases that led in circles, of fires that never warmed, of dolls that watched but never blinked. They spoke of a ceiling that creaked in rhythm with a heartbeat. None of them owned They remembered no food, no sleep, only the sound that asked them to stay. And then one day, the whisper turned to a question. Do you remember why you came? None of them did, and that night they awoke back in the village square, with no memory of walking. The vanishing day was a Thursday when the sun didn't rise. At first, people thought it was weather, a thick fog maybe, or an eclipse. But the clocks, which had begun to move backwards slowly over the last month, now stood still. Roosters didn't crow. Church bells didn't ring. And not a single shadow moved in the whole of Willowmere. In the absence of daylight, something else came forward. The echo was louder now, like wind against glass. It throbbed inside walls and tickled under doors. It came in waves sometimes, repeating the last word a villager had spoken. Other times, it spoke first, and it began to call names. By sundown, or what should have been sundown, 10 people had walked out to the edge house. No one saw them go. No one heard them scream. But all 10 names were heard, whispered through the thatching of the inn roof, and echoed in the wells. Edward, Tomlin, Alice, Father Wren. They were never seen again. Final warnings. An old woman named Gilda, who lived in the north cottage, said she remembered this happening once before, in her childhood. She had written about it in a journal, buried it under the hearthstone, sealed in wax. When the villagers dug it up, the pages were blank, not faded, not burned, blank. Every line of ink lifted clean, as if the story had never allowed itself to be recorded. Later that night, Gilda was found seated at her table, eyes wide open, hands clutching her teacup. Still warm, but she wasn't breathing. Pried from her fingers was a tiny slip of paper. Don't listen past the name. The edge splits. The echo finally stopped being an echo. It began to speak in 2 voices. One male, one female. Both familiar. It used the voices of lost villagers. It laughed like Mabel, coughed like Edward, hummed like Gilda. It took all the recognizable parts of those who had vanished and fed them back into the village like static from a broken radio. And then, one morning, the moor split. Not wide, not loud, but a crack right in front of the edge house. Like the land itself was parting its lips. From it came nothing. No light, no smoke, no heat. Just the faint smell of earth turned too long in darkness. The whisper did not come from within. It came from beneath. The echo at the edge. A letter was found on the altar in the village church. No one saw it placed. It was written in Mabel's handwriting, but signed by someone called the Echo Keeper. It read, "This house does not eat. It remembers, and memory must echo to survive. You came to forget, but forgetting is never silent. The echo at the edge is not a warning. It is an invitation. 1. You already answered." After that, the edge house vanished. Literally, where it had once stood, now only a perfect circle of still grass. And the whisper was no longer heard, because now it was inside the walls, inside the mines, inside the village, waiting for the next name to speak. In the quiet village of Ashbury, winter did not arrive with a storm or even a whisper. It came gently, like an old friend slipping into a room without knocking. The trees stood bare, their limbs reaching like bony fingers toward a colorless sky. The first flakes of snow drifted down slowly, carefully, as if the world might break if winter came too fast. At the edge of the village, just beyond the last gas lamp, sat a lonely cottage with ivy curling around its dark wooden frame. Its windows were cold, yet one of them glowed faintly with candlelight. Behind it sat a girl. Her name was Ellsworth, and she was waiting. No one in Ashbury quite remembered when she had first come to the village. Some said she'd always been there, born during a blizzard so fierce the baker's oven had frozen over. Others whispered she had walked in from the woods one winter night and simply never left. What everyone agreed upon was this: Ellsworth never left her cottage, not truly. She could be seen standing behind the lace curtain each evening at the same Hour, a pale figure watching the falling snow. She never aged. Her cheeks stayed rosy like the first frost, her long silver blonde hair untouched by time. And her eyes, pale as frozen milk, never blinked when she stared. The villagers made a habit of walking a little faster when passing her window, especially in winter. Years passed, but winter always returned to Ashbury like clockwork. And so did Ellsworth's gaze. There was once a little boy curious, as boys are, who dared to knock on her door. His name was Tom. He'd heard stories from the older children that she was a ghost, or worse, that she was still alive but trapped by a curse. It was late December. A blanket of snow silenced the world, and Ashbury's streets lay empty beneath a sky painted the color of pewter. Tom, bundled in layers too thick for movement, crept up to her crooked fence. He stepped over it. The crunch of snow beneath his boots echoed in his ears like breaking bones. As he reached the door, his hand hesitated in the cold air. Then, 3 knocks. Nothing. He turned to go. But just as he reached the gate again, he heard it. A voice soft as falling snow. Do you know what it means to wait? He spun around. There was no one on the porch. Only the curtain moved, ever so slightly. He never spoke of it again. He never knocked again. He never even looked in that direction when walking to school. And neither did anyone else. But still, every winter, the candle glowed in her window, and Ellsworth watched. The village changed. People moved. Ashbury grew quieter with each passing year. Shops closed. The bell at St. Isidore's Chapel stopped ringing. And yet Ellsworth remained. She never left. One spring, an old woman named Agnes, who had lived nearly a century and remembered the world before war, wrote a letter to her niece in London. In it, she described the girl in the window. She's the only thing left that doesn't change, Agnes wrote. I think she's waiting for someone or something. And I fear that if she ever stops, winter might never leave Ashbury. There were strange things about the snow in Ashbury. It never melted completely. Even in late March, a dusting lingered in shadowed places. The graveyard behind the chapel remained frozen longer than any other ground. And though the roads were plowed and salted, they often iced again within hours. Only in Ashbury. Someone once invited a meteorologist to study the phenomenon. He arrived, took measurements, and left the next day. He never wrote his report. In 1981, a curious priest named Father Bellamy came to Ashbury to revive the parish. He was young, hopeful, and unnerved by very little. That changed during his second winter. One bitter January evening, he walked to Ellsworth's cottage. Perhaps he thought her lonely. Perhaps he hoped to bless the home. He knocked gently, then firmly. Then he whispered a prayer and tried the handle. It turned. The door creaked open just enough to reveal a thin slice of dim interior. Cold air poured from the crack like breath from a crypt. He stepped back. And then, in the silence, the door shut itself. He never returned to that street again. He resigned 3 months later, citing unexplainable unease. Children grew, moved away. Elderly villagers passed on. The Ashbury bakery collapsed in a storm. Ivy consumed most of the empty cottages. And one day, a group of surveyors arrived, men in orange vests with maps and machines. They didn't notice Ellsworth. Or perhaps they did, because their plans never moved forward. One evening, a single snowflake fell in August. Then another. By morning, the whole village lay beneath 6 inches of pure white. Ellsworth remained. Watching. Waiting. Each winter, heavier than the last. Each snowfall colder than memory. No one knew who or what she waited for. But one thing was certain: the first snow never fell. Until she blinked. The sun hadn't touched the village of Eldergrove for 3 days now. Gray clouds swelled above like bloated, pregnant beasts refusing to burst, while a bitter stillness clung to the air. No birds, no wind, No voices inside the reverends. Parlor, Mrs. Constance Bellamy sat rigid on a wooden stool, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Before her, the hearthstone carved and centuries old remained unlit. Not for lack of trying, they had stoked it with the driest logs in town, drenched it with oil, whispered old prayers over it. And yet, the fire would not take. "They say it's cursed," came a voice from behind. It was Edwin Carr, the blacksmith's son, no older than 25. Standing in the doorway with soot-streaked cheeks and a tremor in his voice, he tried to hide that the chimney was built over an unmarked grave, that it weeps ash, not smoke. Constance did not turn to him. Her eyes were fixed on the hearth, on the darkened interior that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "It's not cursed," she replied. "It's remembering." Edwin furrowed his brow. "Remembering what, ma'am?" She stood, brushed the dust from her coat, and walked over to the mantel. Her fingers traced the initials carved into the stone. HE-1612. Harold Eldon, she said softly. "The founder's son, burned alive on this very hearth. Locked inside by his own father, who thought him possessed." Edwin took an unconscious step back. "That's not in any of the town records." "No," said Constance, turning slowly. "Because it's in the stone." She stepped aside, and Edwin caught sight of what she meant. Just above the firebox, carved so finely it nearly vanished with time, was a shape a boy. Arms reaching, mouth open, not crying out, but singing. Farther across the village, a similar chill had taken root in the home of Darrell and Hetty Green. Darrell was a skeptical man by nature, one of the last to call a priest when the world went. Strange, but now even he was shaken that their own fireplace had done the same, refused to burn. Worse, when Darrell had tried to clean it, he'd found the bricks wet, as if bleeding from within. When he reached to touch one, it hissed like a kettle, and bit into his hand. He didn't sleep that night. Neither did Hetty. Their house creaked more than usual, but it wasn't wood. It was something breathing, waiting, listening. The next morning, they fled. They weren't alone. Throughout Eldergrove, a pattern emerged. Hearths extinguishing themselves, heat retreating, stone darkening with old soot. At first, villagers blamed the weather, then the coal, then each other. But the truth whispered louder with each passing day. Fire had left them. And when the fire left, the cold became alive. The vicar, Reverend Sallow, addressed the village in the chapel square, his voice strained but forceful. "We are not punished. We are not cursed. We are only being reminded of things we let ourselves forget." "Like what?" a woman cried out. "Like how this village was born in fire," he answered, "and what we burned to keep it." An uncomfortable hush followed. Only the ravens stirred on the chapel steeple. A child named Elsie, no older than 9, became the next to speak truth. The adults were too fearful to say dash. She stood at the edge of the chapel garden where the rosemary grew and pointed to the old well. "Lives down there now," she said simply. "Who?" asked the schoolmaster, trying not to smile. "The boy who was singing in our fireplace." The laughter that followed was nervous. Too sharp, too forced. But no one dared approach the well. By the end of the week, 23 hearths had gone cold. 5 homes were abandoned. In every silent chimney, soot ran in patterned shapes of fingers, mouths, notes of music etched in grime. Only the oldest residents of Eldergrove knew the full tale. That long ago, in a winter not unlike this, a child with a gift for song had been born. His voice could calm storms, they said. Melt frost from the window panes. But his song changed. One day, it turned dark, off-key, like something else had found his voice and was using it to speak back. The village, terrified, did what terrified villages do best. They locked him in the fireplace and lit the match. Now, centuries later, his lullaby had returned, But it didn't come from the wind. It came from the stone. Constance Bellamy, who had once been a historian before becoming the town's reluctant archivist, began sleeping in front of her hearth. She kept candles lit around the room, not for light, but in hope that fire would choose to return. And then one night, it did, but only for a moment. The flame sparked without help. It flickered blue, danced once, and hissed into smoke. But in that flicker, Constance saw him. The boy. In soot. Smiling. They called a council, those few brave enough to confront the truth. Reverend Sallow, Constance Bellamy, the midwife Agnes, and even skeptical Darrell Green all gathered beneath the chapel's old oak, where blood had been spilled for less. He doesn't want revenge, Agnes said, fingers trembling. He wants to be remembered. Reverend Sallow nodded slowly. Then we build him a fire. A fire for what? Darrell snapped. For a ghost? No, Constance said. For a boy. The following day, the town gathered at the green with timber, coal, and the oldest of fiddles. Children were taught a song soft and strange, full of open vowels and lingering notes. No one knew the language. It didn't matter. As night fell, they built a hearth in the middle of the square, not inside a home, but in the open. The stone used was the same quarried from the old chapel, the kind that remembered things. They didn't pray, they sang, and the fire came from the hearth. Blue flames rose, not in anger, but in recognition. It hissed in harmony with the wind. The chimney stones pulsed with warmth. The frost retreated. Smoke coiled upward like a ribbon to the sky. Some say they saw a figure in the flame. A boy in a nightshirt, no longer screaming, just listening and smiling. From that day forward, no fireplace in Eldergrove ever refused a flame again. But the villagers changed. They sang before each fire was lit, always the same strange tune. Always at dusk. And always in the boy's memory, because now they knew it wasn't that the hearth wouldn't burn. It's that it waited until someone remembered why it mattered. The snow had thickened over Langmarsh. What began as a gentle white dusting had now swallowed fences, erased pathways, and muffled all sound under its weight. The village was silent, except for the chimney. Agnes knew she hadn't imagined it. It was dusk again, and the fire still wouldn't catch. But now something worse. Something she could no longer pretend wasn't there. It started with the faintest of murmurs, like wind twisting inside a bottle. Then syllables, whispers, and sometimes the distinct lilt of a child's voice. She'd freeze, motionless in the kitchen, staring up at the blackened chimney mouth as if it might speak again. Then it would stop. The house would return to its glacial silence, and Agnes would tell herself it was nothing. Wind, bricks shifting, an old woman's nerves. But the voices didn't stay whispers. On the third night, they spoke her name. Agnes. She dropped her bowl. It shattered on the stone floor, the sound startling in the quiet. Heart hammering, she ran to the hearth, her breath fogging in the cold. Agnes, why didn't you come when we called? The voice was small, feminine, close. Her hand moved instinctively to the iron poker resting by the stove. She gripped it tight, stepping back from the fireless hearth. Who's there? She called. Her voice cracked in the still air. No reply. But she could smell something now, not smoke. Something like old candle wax, melted tallow, and rosemary. She lit a candle and stepped forward. As she peered up the chimney shaft, the flame in her hand flickered violently. The draft wasn't from the outside, it was pushing outward, as though something exhaled from within. Then a sound like small fingers tapping brick. Agnes stumbled back, her head spinning. She knew what she must do, though it filled her. With dread. She returned the next morning, bundled in wool, to the town's long-shuttered archives, a cold room behind the chapel where death records, births, and marriage licenses were kept in dusty, unalphabetized stacks. She had to know who had lived in her house before, who had died there, The clerk, a young lad with large spectacles, was reluctant at first. But something in Agnes's voice, or perhaps the way she kept glancing nervously at the hearth behind him, convinced him to help. They found it after hours of searching. A family, the Morleys, parents and 5 children, died in 1831. The whole family within 2 weeks. Cause of death listed only as accidental suffocation. Agnes leaned over the brittle paper. What happened? The boy swallowed. There was a chimney sweep shortage. That winter, dangerous conditions. Several families tried to light fires anyway. But the soot, when it builds up, well, the smoke can't escape. He paused. They say the Morleys never even got the fire lit. The children were playing near the hearth. When the smoke finally came, it was too late. Agnes was already leaving. That night, she did not sleep. She sat by the hearth, poker in hand, staring into its unlit void. At midnight, the voices returned. But this time, there were many, not just one child, but 2, 3, then 5. Laughter and crying overlapping, like memories echoing off stone. We're cold, Agnes. Come find us. The wind screamed down the chimney. The candle blew out. Then behind her, a low thud. Agnes turned slowly. The cellar door had creaked open. A sound from below, scratching, and a child's giggle. Agnes gripped her coat tighter, lifted her candle again, and made for the stairs leading downward. She didn't want to go. Everything inside her screamed to run, but those voices, they sounded like they were waiting for her. She opened the door. Below, in the pitch dark, something moved and whispered, "We remember the fire, Agnes, but you can light it for us now." The nights were longer now. Even when dawn crept in behind the hills, it only brought a dull, ash-colored light to the village of Elderby. The sun, it seemed, had grown tired of rising. And inside the last cottage on Pinder's Lane, the frost no longer waited for winter. It seeped up through the floorboards in July. Nora Greaves noticed it first. She was a quiet girl, maybe 10, with sharp eyes and a habit of listening more than speaking. While the adults complained of cold winds and bad harvests, she lay awake at night and watched her breath fog in the air. There's something beneath the floor, she told her mother one evening as they ate by the fire. The stew was thin. The fire thinner. It's damp, love. Old houses sweat, her mother replied, already turning away. But it's colder than outside, Nora insisted. It moves under my bed. The mother didn't answer. She was a widow now, after all, and had grown accustomed to ignoring what couldn't be fixed. That night, Nora stayed up. The room she shared with her younger brother Thomas was small and sloped, with beams that creaked when the wind blew hard. She waited until he was asleep, then pulled her quilt tight around her shoulders and stared at the floor. The chill had a rhythm like breathing, a slow inhale of cold, then a pause, then out again, and then came the faintest creak. Floorboard. By floorboard, something shifted below. Not like mice, not like settling wood. No, Nora thought it sounded like someone pacing. Barefoot. She counted the steps. 7 paces forward. A pause. 7 paces back. Again and again. Every night, she began placing small chalk marks where the board seemed most affected. By the end of the week, nearly the entire floor was covered. She tried telling her teacher, her aunt, even the postman. But in Elderby, complaints were like prayers. They floated into the air and vanished. By the second week, Thomas fell ill. It began with cough in sharp, dry hacks that shook his little ribs. Then came fever and the strange bruises along his feet. Purple, cold blotches, as if the chill had gripped him by the ankles. The doctor came and went. Influenza, he said. Rest and tea. But no amount of rest could stop Thomas from waking up in the middle of the night, screaming, pointing at the floor. "It's looking at me," he would cry. That's when Nora began peeling the rug back. She worked late into the night while her mother slept. Candle in one hand, the other, scratching and pulling at the old boards. Beneath the center of the room, her fingers found a seam, a place where the wood didn't quite fit. She pried it up. The space beneath wasn't a crawl space. It was a tunnel. Low and narrow, just enough for someone to lie flat and slide through. The soil was old, packed down like clay, but something had been moving through it, recently, regularly. She felt a gust of air rise up from the dark. Cold, deep cold. Not winter cold, but cellar cold, grave cold. And with it came a smell of parchment and mildew. And something sweet, like rotting fruit. She covered the hole and didn't sleep. The next morning, the village church bell tolled 3 times before noon. Old Mr. Penrose had died, they said in his sleep. Same bruises, same cough, same chill. One by one, it spread. The villagers called it the low illness, the kind that dragged you down. Into bed, into the floor. Nora knew better. She began sketching. The tunnel. Each night she peeled back more floorboards. More tunnels, branching paths beneath every house in Elderby. Some old, some recently disturbed. And always ice cold. Air rising from below. Then she heard the voices, whispers, whimpers, pleas, like someone trapped just below the surface, trying to speak through the wood grain. One night, she pressed her ear to the floor and whispered, "Who are you?" There was a pause, a long one. Then came the faintest answer. "We live where the cold lives," Nora snapped back. The voice hadn't been angry. It had been sad, alone. She thought of Thomas getting weaker, of her mother, worn thin, of the other children who'd stopped showing up to school. The village had forgotten something, some pact, some wrong, buried deep beneath their feet. And now it was coming back up. The final night came with frost on the windows and silence in the trees. Nora returned to the hole. She brought candles, matches, a scarf for her face. She waited until the clock struck midnight, then slipped beneath the floorboards and into the tunnel. The air tasted like stone, like old breath. She crawled for what felt like hours. The walls pulsed faintly with warmth, no heat, like a fever. The deeper she went, the more it changed from icy to stifling. And then, the room. An open hollow, lined with wooden boards on every side. And in the center, 7 child-sized shapes curled on the ground. Eyes closed, breathing, barely. Nora stepped closer. They weren't corpses. They were cold, slumbering, preserved. Their mouths moved faintly, whispering a rhythm. 7 paces forward, 7 back. One of them looked just like Thomas, but it wasn't him. Nora turned, and standing in the farthest corner, where the dark met the wall, was a tall figure. Not a man, not a beast, just shadow, with a face made of swirling frost and chimney soot. It didn't move, but its presence pressed down on her chest, like snow too deep to breathe in. "You left them cold," it whispered. "You built above our sleep." Nora shook her head. "We didn't know." The shadow nodded. "Then remember, warmth must be earned, and stories must not be buried." She backed away, turned, crawled through the tunnels as fast as her limbs would carry her, when she burst through the floorboards again. Dawn was breaking. The cold had lifted. Thomas stirred, then sat up. No bruises, no cough. Nora wept. Later that year, the villagers dug. They uncovered an entire network of burial paths, ritual tunnels, carved long ago by the original settlers of Elderby. A way to bury sorrow beneath the floor. A way to forget the plague that once swept through them. But forgetting came at a cost. Nora never spoke of what she saw beneath. But she always kept her floors warm, always made sure the hearth was fed. And every night, before bed, she walked 7 paces forward, then 7 back, just to let them know they were not forgotten. The snow had fallen again. By morning, the drifts against the windows had risen higher than the sill, filtering the early light into a pale, chalky hush. The air inside the cottage was tight and brittle, like the surface of a frozen lake fragile. Waiting for the first crack to echo across it, Mrs. Thistle was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the hearth that hadn't burned since Epiphany, rubbing her hands as though trying to remember warmth. The girl stood at the edge of the room, framed by the crooked doorway. Her breath made no cloud in the cold. Her arms were bare. She did not tremble. "She's not right," murmured the widow to herself. "Not since the blizzard." But no one in the village was entirely right anymore. The air had grown heavy with things no one named. No one spoke of how the wind sometimes reversed at night, how the trees outside the mill leaned in the wrong direction, or how Father Daltrey had lost half his parishioners, some to death, some to disappearance, and some to silence deeper than any grave. And the girl. The girl had come walking out of the snow 2 weeks ago, barefoot, eyes unblinking, with a smile that was never warm and never quite reached her eyes. The widow had taken her in. She did not remember why, not exactly. There had been something about the girl that made refusal seem unwise. She never ate, though the widow cooked. She never spoke, though her lips sometimes moved when she looked into the hearth. And most unsettling of all, she never shivered. Not even when the night fell hard and the wind howled down the chimney like a trapped child. She should be dead, the butcher had whispered at the tavern, and maybe she is. The visitor on the 12th day of her stay, a man knocked at the door. He was tall, wrapped in a coat of dark wool, and his eyes were the color of splinters. He called himself Mr. Ainsworth, and he said he was with the county orphanage board. "I heard," he said, "that a girl fitting her description wandered into this village. We've been looking for her. She belongs with us." But when he looked at the girl, standing silently at the hearth, his face twitched. "She doesn't belong anywhere," said Mrs. Thistle. "Not anymore. She has no legal name." Continued. "She was found wandering the woods near Grey Hollow 3 winters ago. She didn't speak then either." "You said you'd been looking for her?" "Yes," he said. "We lost track of her 3 months ago. The woman who'd adopted her died. The house burned." Mrs. Thistle looked at the girl again. Still silent, still smiling. "She doesn't even blink," she whispered. Mr. Ainsworth stepped forward. "I'll take her." But the moment he reached out, the hearth cold for weeks flared to life behind her. Not a gentle flicker, but a violent roar. As though something had waited in the ash for his touch, he recoiled. The girl turned her head toward the fire and placed her hand near it, so close it should have burned. But no mark touched her skin. She turned to face him fully, and for the first time, her lips parted. "You can't take me where I already came from." And then she smiled wider, and the flames danced higher still. Mr. Ainsworth backed out of the cottage, stumbled into the cotta. Snow, and ran, leaving no footprints behind. What the fire revealed that night, the widow could not sleep. The fire still burned, though no wood had been placed in it. The girl sat across from her, staring into the flames, humming something old. Mrs. Thistle finally found her courage. "What are you?" The girl turned slowly, and her eyes gleamed with something not quite human, not evil, at least not entirely, but old, cold, and watching. "I am winter's memory," she said softly. "I am what the village forgot. I am the frost that did not melt when the sun rose. I am what waits beneath the snow." Mrs. Thistle wept then, not from fear, but from understanding. The village had buried a girl once, years ago. A girl who had frozen during the long walk home, a girl no one claimed. They had dug a hole, placed her body there, and forgotten. But the cold does not forget, and neither do the lost. She never left in the weeks that followed. The snow did not melt even. As spring approached, one morning, Mrs. Thistle awoke to an empty bed across the room. The fire had gone out. The hearth was filled with white ash and a single bare footprint, small and perfect. The girl was gone, but sometimes on still nights, the children of the village dream of her walking through the woods, touching the trees, speaking in whispers. To the stars. And when the wind howls, parents swear they hear a girl's voice on the edge of the storm. Smiling. Watching. Waiting. Because winter, once it touches a place, never truly leaves. And neither does the girl who didn't shiver. The snow had stopped falling days ago, but Coldbridge remained white, not from snow now, but from a strange, ashen frost that settled without sound. The air no longer stirred. Not even the trees creaked. Every surface, every roof tile, every broken window pane was dusted with a layer so pale, it looked bleached from existence. The villagers who remained indoors had stopped talking. Something about the silence now seemed sacred or cursed. A breath too loud made shutters flutter. A cough and your candles would go out. But she still walked. Little Annabeth, the girl who didn't shiver, who stared down the cold, walked. The village lanes barefoot, not a mark left behind her. Not a trail, only the faintest imprint of warmth, perhaps imagined, in a world where warmth no longer bloomed. She had not spoken since that night by the hearth. Not to her mother, not to the vicar, not even to the shadowed children who peeked out from behind foggy windows. She had seen something in the flames. Something old. Something that had lived beneath the floorboards and in the chimney for too long. And now she followed it. The old mill at the far end of Coldbridge was the first building she entered. Its door swung open with no resistance, not because it welcomed her, but because nothing dared resist. Inside, the machinery had long been still, but the gears, she noticed, bore a thin coating of frost that shimmered faintly. As if alive, she walked among the iron bones of the mill, barefoot, her white nightgown brushing the edges of fallen flour sacks and dust-choked floorboards. In the corner, beneath a broken window, a rusted sack barrow sat leaning, and beside it a handprint in the frost. Small, fresh. Someone had been here. Someone who, like her, followed the whispers in the cold. Next, the bakery. The ovens were cold, had been for months, yet the stone slabs radiated a different kind of heat. A memory of warmth, perhaps, or an echo of something trying to climb back into the world. She stepped around shattered bowls and broken shelves. There was bread here once, joy, even laughter. And in the back room, chalk marks still clung to the blackboard above the kneading table. She burns with frost. The silence walks. Don't open the last door. No one remembered writing them. No one had erased them. Annabeth walked toward the vicar's house next. It stood crooked, like it had been pushed slightly off its foundation. The door had fallen in. Its interior was charred, despite no record of fire. Here, silence was thickest. On the stairs, small items lay scattered. Children's toys, a feather, a single shoe. The vicar's bell lay half-melted beside his prayer book, both untouched by time yet somehow reduced to ruin. And on the fireplace mantel, someone had carved, with shaking hand, "The girl walks, she carries ashes." Annabeth reached out and touched the letters. The frost beneath her fingers sizzled. Outside again, the village seemed to hold its breath. A faint wind now began to move, but it did not whistle or howl. It sang, in a language that was not a language, in voices that had never belonged to any human. Annabeth tilted her head. Yes, she could hear them clearly now. Not whispers, but instructions. A path. A purpose. She turned her bare feet to the last house at the end of the road, the one no one entered, the one where they said cold first came. The house had no roof anymore. Just skeletal beams, and frost dripping like wax from their undersides, but the doorway still stood. It had been blackened, as if by fire, not recent, but not ancient either. Just suspended. Annabeth stepped in. Inside, a single room, filled with snow that hadn't come from the sky. It shimmered strangely, not white, but gray. Not cold, but sharp, like it wanted to slice memory. At the center, a circle of ashes. UNMOVING. And in those ashes, a shape. A small hand, open, palm up, waiting. Annabeth stepped toward it. As her foot entered the ring of ash, the entire room shifted. The snow evaporated, the frost lifted, and the silence, the terrible pressing silence, broke, not with sound, but with breath. Something exhaled. Not her, not the villagers, the house itself, and in that breath, everything changed. In the heart of the ashes, light bloomed, not fire, not heat, but memory. Annabeth saw it all. The first winter years ago, when the cold never ended, the girl who vanished from this house, the parents, who went mad with grief. The frost that came afterward, seeking warmth, seeking her. She saw that the cold wasn't just weather. It was grief. UNTEND. It was sorrow, left in rooms too long. It was silence, unchallenged. And she had been chosen, not because she was strong or brave, but because she was empty. Enough to listen. Annabeth knelt in the circle of ash. Her small fingers touched the hand-shaped imprint. The frost climbed her arm like a vine, not to harm her, but to merge. To remember. To go back to sleep. At sunrise, the villagers emerged. They found her there, lying peacefully in the ruined house. Not breathing, not dead, just still. Her hair dusted with soft gray frost, her hands empty, her face calm, and around her, warmth, the first they had felt in years. The hearths began to burn again that night. And from that day forward, every winter in Coldbridge came gently. The frost never bit, the wind never screamed, and the silence? The silence left, but in the ashes beneath the floorboards of the last house, one small barefoot trail remains. Leading nowhere, ending in peace.